The summer I turned 43, I was running heavy freight out of Savannah up to the Midwest, a job that meant living off coffee and whatever sleep I could steal in the sleeper cab. This particular leg took me through the heart of West Virginia, a run I usually hated because of the tight turns and the way the mountains just seemed to swallow up the cell signal and any sense of civilization. I was pushing close to the legal limit on drive time, and around midnight, exhaustion finally got the better of me. I needed to pull over, but finding a spot big enough for a 53-foot trailer off US 23 isn't easy. I eventually spotted a small, overgrown turnout sign for what looked like a forgotten public campground, probably for a local lake. The sign was rusted through and nearly hidden by kudzu, but the asphalt was cracked enough to let me maneuver the rig off the highway. It was one of those places that felt like time had stopped decades ago. There was a single derelict wooden lake house cabin barely standing 100 yards from the water and a gravel loop for maybe 5 camping spots, all choked with tall, wet grass. I shut down the roaring diesel, the silence that followed immediately deafening. It was a suffocating quiet, broken only by the distant, slow hum of the crickets, and the thick, humid air was heavy with the smell of pine needles, lake muck, and mildew. I quickly ran through my mental checklist. Doors locked, curtains drawn tight, phone charged, no signal, naturally. I cracked a window, just enough to let some air in, and then I settled back, hoping for 5 or 6 hours of uninterrupted dark. I had been asleep for maybe 3 hours, the deep, desperate sleep only truckers know, when a sound snapped me awake. It wasn't loud, not a bang or a shout, but a small, distinct sound of scuff on the gravel outside the sleeper cab. It was close, too close to be a deer wandering through, and too specific to be the wind shifting a pine branch. I lay absolutely motionless, my heart immediately beginning that rapid, dull thumping against my ribs that tells you something is profoundly wrong. I strained my ears, waiting for the sound to repeat. Nothing, just the continued, heavy, breathless silence of the Appalachian night. I slowly reached up and peeled back the thin curtain on the side window, just enough to create a sliver of darkness to peer through. My breath hitched in my throat. I was expecting maybe a raccoon, a coyote, or, worst of all, some local kids looking to mess with an out-of-state rig. What I saw wasn't any of those things. It wasn't trouble in the traditional sense. It was something far, far worse. Standing motionless at the water's edge, maybe 50 yards from where my truck was parked, was a shape. It was turned away from me, facing the black, glassy surface of the lake. The moonlight, pale and filtered through the clouds, wasn't strong, but it was just enough to outline the thing's disturbing silhouette. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, judging by the way it seemed to eclipse the low-hanging branches behind it. But the height wasn't the worst part. It was the impossible thinness. It was impossibly lean, a frame of bones and taut sinew stretched out in a way that defied normal human anatomy. It was not wearing clothes. Its skin was the color of wet river stone, a deep, matte gray that seemed to absorb the scant light, but the water of the lake caught a dull, chilling reflection off of it. It just stood there completely still. Its head was tilted slightly to the side, perhaps listening to the water, perhaps listening to something in the dense forest line far across the cove. It held a posture that suggested both profound patience and a kind of terrible, ancient fragility. The feeling that washed over me wasn't just fear, it was pure, paralyzing dread, the kind that steals the oxygen from your lungs and freezes the blood in your veins. It was the absolute, certain knowledge that I was looking at something that did not belong in a natural world, something that shouldn't exist, an aberration pulled from the deepest, coldest depths of the wilderness. My mind, trained to rationalize mechanical failures and logistical problems, struggled violently to categorize it. Feral man? Sickened animal? None of it fit the way the light fell across its unnaturally long limbs or the inhuman stillness of its stance. I knew that any sudden move, any scrape of fabric or shift of weight would betray my presence. It was a primal certainty, so I didn't move. I stayed glued to the window, my eye burning as I tracked the figure. The minutes crawled by, stretched thin and silent, feeling less like minutes and more like an hour of pure psychological torture. I didn't dare reach for the phone on the dashboard. The light from a screen would have been a beacon in the oppressive dark, drawing its unnatural attention straight to the thin metal shell of my truck. I could hear my own shallow, rapid breathing, and I tried desperately to slow it down. Every pulse in my neck felt loud enough to carry across the gravel lot. The figure didn't flinch. It didn't take a step. It just maintained that sickening, watchful stillness, the top of its head barely visible above the bank. I started to wonder what it wanted, why it was there. Was it waiting for something to emerge from the water? Was it hunting? Or was it just existing? The thought that this thing might spend its life standing alone on riverbanks in the dark, patiently watching, was deeply disturbing. It spoke of a cold, indifferent survival that was far worse than any active threat. Finally, after what felt like the moment time itself was about to shatter, the figure moved. It didn't turn around. It didn't run. Without changing the terrifying angle of its head, it took a single, slow, deliberate step backward. Then another and another. It retreated silently into the dense, pitch-black woods that framed the back of the derelict lake house. The darkness there was absolute, a wall of trees that seemed to drink the moonlight and hold secrets. The figure was simply absorbed by it, disappearing without the slightest sound of breaking a twig or rustling a leaf. The forest swallowed it whole, and the air immediately felt heavier, colder, as if the space it had occupied was now filled with a vacuum. I didn't move for the rest of the night. I couldn't. I sat rigid, staring at the spot where the figure had been, convinced that it would reappear at any second, or that I would hear the wet scuff of its movement right next to my fuel tank. Every sound, the settling of the truck frame, the faraway drone of a car on the highway, the inevitable sigh of the wind through the pines, made me jump. I kept my hand on the handle of my heavy-duty flashlight, knowing full well that a beam of light wouldn't stop whatever that thing was, but feeling some animal need to be ready. I didn't take a full, deep breath until the first sliver of weak, gray light began to filter through the trees. As the shadows receded, the cold, ancient dread slowly began to lift, replaced by a terrible, nauseating clarity. It wasn't a nightmare. It was real. I started the engine, threw the massive truck into gear, and peeled out of that forgotten campground, not even bothering to check my tires. I drove east toward the rising sun, and even after hours on the road, the skin on my back felt cold and prickly, forever remembering the sight of that tall, lean silhouette standing motionless at the edge of the black water, watching the darkness. I know there are things hidden in those mountains that people can't explain away, things that move only at night, and sometimes they stop to stand and stare at the water or at you. I never drove that route again. Story 2. The middle of July is a brutal time for hauling freight across the South, and by the time I pulled into Tennessee, my patience was gone and my body was running on fumes. I was 3 days overdue for a proper rest, the kind you can't get slumped over a steering wheel. I decided to use some accrued vacation time and take a mandatory 2-day break. I found a listing for a cheap, private lake house rental near Douglas Lake. Far enough off I-40 that the quiet would be absolute, but close enough that I wouldn't waste half a day driving. The place was barely more than a shack, old and listing toward the water, smelling permanently of mildew and lake mud, but it had a real bed and a refrigerator, which felt like a 5-star hotel to me. I parked my rig, a massive, shining target, out on the small, gravel turnaround, told myself no one would bother it this far out in the woods, and tried to settle in. The first night was fine. I slept like a dead man for 12 straight hours. The second night, however, was when the quiet turned against me. I was woken up sometime after midnight, not by a noise, but by a sudden, heavy pressure in the air. The kind of unnerving silence that immediately tells you the natural world has stopped observing its rules. I sat up in bed, straining to hear anything over the rapid, thick thudding of my own heart. And then the sound started. It was a scream, but to call it just a scream doesn't do it justice. It was high-pitched, awful, and undeniably human in its tone of sheer terror and pain, the kind of sound you only hear in your worst nightmares. It was a woman's voice, raw and desperate, but layered beneath the shriek was something deeply unnatural, a thick, guttural shudder, a sound that resonated not from a set of lungs, but from somewhere lower, deeper in the throat. It was too prolonged to be a singular moment of pain. It was sustained, agonizing, and wrong. The sound was coming from the lake, specifically from the area near the dock, which was maybe 30 yards behind the house. My first, immediate thought was pure horror. I was witnessing a murder. Someone was out there, drowning, or being dragged into the water. Every moral instinct told me to call the police, to rush out there, but every survival instinct was screaming at me to stay put and lock the flimsy door. I scrambled out of bed, grabbing the biggest, heaviest thing I owned, my industrial-grade maglite, and crept toward the back porch, my bare feet silent on the cold linoleum floor. The lake was invisible from the front, but when I reached the porch door and peered out through the grimy window, I saw the dock. It was a rickety, moss-covered structure that jutted 10 feet out into the black water. The moon was obscured by clouds, so the lake was an absolute sheet of darkness, reflecting nothing, like a massive, polished obsidian mirror. The screams were still happening, piercing the night, echoing off the surrounding hillsides. I could pinpoint the source, right there at the end of the dock, or perhaps just beneath it. I wrestled with the door, finally managing to slide it open a crack, holding my breath. The night air was freezing despite the summer heat, and the sound of the suffering out on the water was overwhelming. I stepped onto the porch just as the screams abruptly, violently stopped. The cutoff was immediate and absolute, leaving behind a ringing, traumatic silence. I stood there, paralyzed, expecting to hear a muffled shout, a splash, the sound of a boat pulling away, anything to explain the horrific vacuum of noise. Instead, a new sound began. It was a strange, slow, deliberate splashing, not like a thrashing or struggling person, but like something heavy being moved through water right under the dock. Splush, drag, splush. It was rhythmic, almost casual, and it was unnerving because it seemed to imply effort, not distress. It sounded like something was methodically moving something else through the shallows. I raised a maglite, my hands shaking so badly the heavy metal rod felt like a feather. I flicked it on. The beam was a solid, powerful column of light, and I swept it across the dock and then onto the water. The surface was empty. The sound of the methodical splashing immediately ceased the instant the light hit the water, replaced again by that unnerving, profound silence. Nothing but the inky, glassy surface remained. My relief lasted less than a second. As I started to pull the beam back toward the house, across the end of the dock, I caught a glimpse of movement right on the edge of the wood, just where the structure met the bank. It was a shadow, a shape, not fully illuminated, but impossibly fast, hunched over something I couldn't see. It was low to the ground, wide across the shoulders, and its motion was less like a person running and more like a heavy animal skittering. In the fraction of a second the light touched it, I saw a flash of something pale and slick, maybe skin, maybe wet wood, and then it was gone. It had been focused on whatever was at its feet, utterly absorbed in its task. And then, the worst part, the shadow didn't retreat into the woods. Instead, it moved with a sudden, powerful lunge. There was a single, heavy plunge sound, the sound of a mass of solid weight hitting the water, and the surface of the lake immediately broke into a violent eruption of spray. Whatever it was, it had thrown itself, or its hidden prey, into the deep water. The light beam was still centered on the spot where it had been. All that was left was the slow, chilling ripple spreading outward from the dock, moving across the undisturbed surface of the lake, distorting the reflection of the few faraway stars. I stood there, frozen, until the ripples died down and the lake returned to its state of black, mirrored stillness. My mind raced, trying to put the pieces together. The human-sounding screams, the subsequent deep, methodical splashing, the hunched, fast shadow, and the final, violent plunge into the depths. It wasn't a murder I had witnessed. It was a feeding. The initial screams had been a lure, or perhaps the terrible final protest of prey. The splashing was the thing cleaning up or moving its catch. And the figure I saw had been the hunter, the thing that lived in the dark, and its lair was now the deepest part of that lake. I backed slowly into the lake house, never taking my eyes off the dock. I slid the porch door shut, locked the flimsy deadbolt, and then proceeded to lock every window and door in the house, throwing chairs and luggage against the main entrances for good measure. I grabbed my phone, confirming again that I had no signal. I was utterly isolated. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat on the floor with my back pressed against the wall farthest from the lake, holding the heavy flashlight like a weapon, straining to hear any further movement. I kept imagining the pale, slick flash I'd seen on the dock, imagining it swimming slowly, silently, through the black depths, its eyes adjusted to the total darkness, knowing exactly where I was, knowing I was awake. I kept going over the pitch and quality of that terrible, awful, human but wrong scream, certain that whatever made that sound, and whatever I saw disappear beneath the ripples, was still waiting in the deep water, patient and hungry. At the first faint hint of sunlight, before the sun even cleared the far eastern ridges, I was out of that house. I didn't bother to pack everything neatly. I just tossed my duffel bag into the truck and climbed into the cab. I didn't look at the dock, didn't look at the lake. I focused only on the gravel lot and the path back to the highway. As the diesel engine roared to life, breaking the tense silence, I caught one last, quick glance in my side mirror. The black glass of the lake surface was now starting to turn a flat, dull gray with the light. And on the middle beam of the dock, precisely where the shadow had been hunched over, I saw a large, dark, slick stain slowly drying in the morning air. It looked like oil or perhaps something organic, and it was already attracting a cloud of large, buzzing flies. I slammed the shifter into gear and drove away from that lake house and the deep, silent horror held. I drove hard for 6 hours, not stopping until I was out of Tennessee, the memory of that terrible human scream and the sound of the final, decisive plunge echoing in my ears, a chilling reminder that some creatures of the Appalachian wilderness hunt on the shore, but they take their meals into the cold, deep dark. Story 3. The delivery schedule had been brutal for 3 straight days, and by the time I was pointed towards Smith Mountain Lake in Virginia, the sun was long gone. My drop-off was supposed to be a small resort complex, but the GPS led me down a winding, badly maintained side road that terminated at a scattering of massive, isolated vacation homes. The dispatch notes vaguely mentioned using the secondary storage dock, which sounded ridiculous for an 18-wheeler, but I was too tired to argue. The road was barely wide enough for my tires, and the trees pressed in so tightly that the air felt thick and close, insulating the sound of my engine. It was already 3 a.m., the blackest hour of the night, when I finally spotted the structure, a huge, darkened lake house, 3 stories high, set back from the road. It looked entirely empty, not a single light on, and the only delivery access seemed to be a narrow, cracked concrete pad around the back. I began the tedious process of maneuvering the massive rig, the transmission groaning in the silence, trying to line the trailer up with the low delivery dock. The task required me to back up about 100 yards, using my powerful spot mirrors and occasionally leaning out the window. It was during this slow, careful backing maneuver that the main headlights swept the lawn of the massive house. The light was bright and cold, cutting a sharp wedge into the absolute darkness of the surrounding woods. And that's when I saw it. It was standing on the lawn, about 50 feet away, partially obscured by a dense stand of scrub pines and rhododendron bushes. The headlights caught it square in the chest. My foot instinctively slammed on the brake pedal, locking the air brakes with a loud hiss that fractured the quiet. The rig shuddered to a stop. What I saw wasn't a bear, though that was my first desperate guess. It was massive, far larger than any black bear I had ever encountered, easily reaching the 6-foot mark in height, maybe more, and it was undeniably bipedal. Its posture was terrible, hunched over, its back rounded and its head slightly bowed, giving it a slouching, almost simian look. It stood with a sickening stillness, just watching the movement of my truck. It wasn't wearing anything, or if its covering was the exact texture and color of the dead, wet soil and matted undergrowth, a dull, uneven brown-black. It was thickly built, muscular in an archaic, disturbing way, with arms that seemed far too long for its torso, dangling nearly to its knees. I sat there, absolutely frozen, trying to process the sheer, impossible scale of the thing. It shifted its weight slightly, a slow, swaying movement that suggested a heavy, uncomfortable presence. Then, the low beam of the headlights hit its eyes. They weren't glowing with a yellow or green reflection like a cat or a deer. They were two dull, reflecting embers, a flat, burnt orange, almost red. They were wide-set, and they were fixed entirely on the cab of my truck, tracking me with an intelligence that stole the breath from my chest. It wasn't the look of a curious animal. It was the look of a predator who had just spotted its prey and was waiting for the right moment to strike. My training and my fear intersected violently. I didn't want to alert it, but I needed to know if noise would scare it off. My hand instinctively grabbed the cord for the air horn. I pulled it down hard. The massive, deafening blast of the dual air horn ripped through the silent valley, a sound that could wake the dead and send any rational creature, man or beast, running for cover. The air horn sounded for 3 solid seconds. The sound was physically painful inside the cab. When I released the cord, the silence rushed back in, but the silence was now loaded with the noise of my own heart trying to beat its way out of my chest. And the thing didn't even flinch. It stayed rooted to its spot on the lawn. Then, slowly, deliberately, with a terrible mechanical stiffness, it tilted its massive, unformed head to the side, adjusting its line of sight on the cab. The dual red embers of its eyes were still fixed on me. And in that slow turn, I felt a chilling, terrifying certainty. The sound, the aggression, the size of my truck, none of it mattered. This creature was not afraid of volume, machinery, or light. It was looking at me not as a nuisance, but as a potential meal, and its lack of reaction spoke of cold, ancient hunger, and a lifetime spent unchallenged in the darkest places. I didn't need to see its teeth or its claws. That single, slow turn of its head was enough. Rationality dissolved completely. I immediately threw the transmission lever down into drive, abandoned the delivery, abandoned the paperwork, and slammed my foot down on the accelerator. The diesel engine roared back to life, the tires squealing and spitting gravel as the massive rig jolted forward, tearing up the grass of the lawn in my desperate escape. I didn't look forward, only checking my left side mirror, terrified that the thing was already loping alongside the cab. As I swung the trailer wildly back onto the narrow, winding service road, the last sight in my mirror was the hulking shadow moving. It didn't chase in a panic. It simply took one enormous, loping stride, covering maybe 20 feet, and entered the very edge of the gravel driveway, positioning itself where it could watch my frantic, clumsy retreat. It was almost leisurely, as if it knew I wouldn't stop, and it would simply wait for the next unsuspecting vehicle. I didn't slow down for miles, rattling and shaking the rig over the rough Appalachian roads, until I hit the relative safety of a state highway. My hands were white-knuckled on the wheel, slick with cold sweat. I called dispatch only when I finally got a single bar of signal, giving them a vague, panicked excuse about mechanical failure and an impassable road. Later that week, I did some digging, trying to rationalize what I saw. I found out the lake house wasn't a private home at all. It was owned by a massive corporate entity in Florida and was rarely visited. It was used primarily as an off-site, unstaffed storage and utility facility for the main, private lodge that was indeed situated high up the hill. Nobody lived there. Nobody should have been there. The place was a magnet for isolation, a perfect hunting ground for something that needed absolute quiet to thrive. The image of that massive, hunched silhouette, its eyes reflecting dull, predatory red in my headlights, is burned into my mind. I've heard all the folklore over the years, the feral people, the mountain giants, the things that were too inbred and isolated to be classified. But this felt different. It was an apex predator of the ancient darkness. And the most terrifying part of the entire encounter was that it didn't run from the sound of a roaring diesel engine and a deafening air horn. It knew it didn't have to. It was simply waiting. I never took another load anywhere near Smith Mountain Lake. And even now, the sound of a truck horn can bring back the chilling realization that somewhere in those silent, endless Appalachian woods, a huge, terrible shadow is still watching, eternally hungry. Story 4. The night I saw that hand, I was running on fumes, hauling a load of industrial piping through Kentucky, trying to get to Louisville before sunrise. I'd missed my planned rest stop due to a closure, and after driving for 18 hours straight, I was hallucinating road signs. I knew I couldn't push any further. I needed a spot big enough for the rig, flat enough to avoid tipping, and preferably far enough off the highway that the sound of passing traffic wouldn't keep me awake. Not far from Cave Run Lake, near an exit for I-64, I spotted a gravel turnaround. It was next to what looked like an old, two-story lake house, long abandoned, its windows boarded up and the whole structure listing toward the nearby woods. It was a spot I'd heard other drivers mention, a quick, unofficial place to grab a couple hours' sleep. I pulled the massive truck off the asphalt and into the crunchy, weed-choked gravel lot, shut down the engine, and slumped back into the sleeper cab, instantly feeling the heavy relief of absolute exhaustion. I fell into a deep, dreamless sleep that felt more like passing out. I woke up abruptly around 1 a.m., the internal clock of a long-haul trucker rarely failing. I was instantly aware that I wasn't alone. The silence had been broken by sound, and it was a sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. It was barking, but it wasn't the sharp, recognizable bark of a dog. This sound was wrong. It was too breathy, too low, almost sounding like a parody of a canine bark. It would start with a low, choking growl, rise into a quick, sharp yip, and then end with a strange, audible, wet clicking sound on the inhalation like a bone being sucked dry. It was close. Too close. It sounded like whatever was making the noise was standing right outside the driver's side of my cab. I sat up slowly, quietly, not moving a muscle, my heart starting its familiar, heavy pound against my ribs. I strained to see through the windshield, which offered a poor view of the immediate ground around the truck due to the angle of the hood. I scanned the darkness, expecting to see a skinny, feral hound, perhaps chasing a raccoon. But there was nothing. No movement. No shape, just the blackness of the night and the awful, repetitive, clicking bark, now coming from directly outside the passenger side door. I turned my head toward the passenger window. The curtains were drawn, but I could peer through the narrow gap where they overlapped. I didn't see a muzzle or a collar. I didn't see the dark outline of an animal. Instead, I saw a hand. It was pressed flat against the glass of the passenger side door, blocking the dim, distant moonlight. It was large, much larger than any normal human hand, and unervingly pale. It was almost translucent, like wet parchment or something that had been bleached of all pigment. The fingers were long, horrifyingly slender, and splayed wide, the pale skin distorted slightly by the pressure against the glass. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the sheer, shocking wrongness of it. It looked like the hand of a drowned thing, unnaturally smooth, but terminating in what looked like dull, brownish claws, not fingernails. And the sound, that horrible, low, clicking bark, was still coming from just below the window line, precisely where the body attached to the hand would have to be. I froze, locked in a state of paralyzing dread. My mind was screaming, trying to make the physics work. My truck is a huge machine. The passenger window is easily 5 feet off the ground. If that hand was pressed against the glass, the creature had to be tall. But the sound of the bark was coming from down low, hidden beneath the lip of the hood and the bottom of the window frame. I was trying to reconcile a creature tall enough to press a hand to the window with one that sounded like it was hunched over, sniffing the dirt. Was it leaning? Was it kneeling? The position suggested a terrible, unnatural flexibility, or maybe that the entire creature was simply built wrong. Sweat started to run down my temples, cold and clammy. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare breathe loudly. I just stared at that pale, massive hand, its fingers occasionally twitching almost imperceptibly against the glass. It wasn't scratching, it wasn't banging. It was simply waiting and watching, the owner of the hand breathing that awful, clicking sound below my line of sight. It felt less like a threat and more like an intense, scientific examination, like an insect being studied under a lens. The silence returned for a heart-stopping moment, broken only by the deafening pulse in my own ears. Then the hand moved. Slowly, deliberately, unnervingly smoothly, it slid away from the glass. I watched the pale shape vanish into the darkness. I thought, with a burst of frantic, momentary relief, that it was leaving. But then I heard a new sound. A quick, grating, high-pitched scraping sound on metal. It wasn't on the door or the side panel. It was coming from directly above me. Scrape, scrape. It was the sound of something heavy and sharp climbing. Claws on aluminum. Whatever it was, it hadn't left the truck. It had simply reached up and was now pulling itself onto the smooth, curved metal roof of my sleeper cab. The sound was distinct and chilling, the faint vibration traveling through the whole structure. It had managed to climb the massive tire, hoist itself onto the hood, and was now occupying the tiny space right above my head. The barking noise was gone, replaced by a low, rhythmic thump directly over my pillow, the heavy sound of a body settling onto the roof. I imagined the weight, the mass, the sheer size of the creature that had just been pressing its hand to my window, now resting a few inches of metal above my skull. Terror gave way to a cold, focused surge of adrenaline. I needed to move, and I needed to move now. But if I started the engine suddenly, the creature, startled, might drop directly onto the windshield or the hood. I moved with agonizing slowness, reaching quietly for the key in the ignition. My fingers were trembling so hard, I almost missed the hole. I inserted the key, turned it just to the accessory position to warm the glow plugs, and then, with one decisive violent twist, I cranked the massive diesel engine. The roar of the engine was deafening in the tiny lot. I immediately threw the transmission into drive, slammed the air brakes release, and stomped on the accelerator. The truck lurched forward, tires spitting the gravel into the night. My prayer was simple. Inertia, the sudden, violent acceleration, the speed, the rattling of the rough road. I hoped it would simply be thrown off the flat roof of the cab. As I swerved onto the highway and hit 70 miles per hour, I listened intently. I didn't dare look into the spot mirror or the main mirror. I just listened to the roar of the engine and the whistling rush of the wind. After about a minute of hard, frantic driving, I heard one last, faint sound, a final, sharp clang from somewhere behind the rig, followed by the sound of something heavy hitting the asphalt and instantly being swept away by the wind and the darkness. I didn't slow down for another 2 hours. When I finally reached a well-lit, busy truck stop, I immediately parked and got out, shaking uncontrollably, and walked around the entire rig with my flashlight. I checked the roof of the sleeper cab. There, on the smooth aluminum, were 5 long, thick gouges etched into the metal, running in parallel lines from the center toward the back edge. They were deep, almost through the aluminum siding. And on the passenger window, the pale, dusty print of that enormous, slender hand was still clearly visible in the thin coating of road dust. Whatever it was, feral, mutated, or something pulled from the deep, dark legends of the mountains. It was cunning, quiet, and possessed of a terrible patience. It had been studying me, perhaps testing the boundary of the truck, and when it found it couldn't simply open the door, it decided to use the only way left to climb onto its silent, sleeping meal. I still haul freight through the Appalachians, but every time I stop for the night, I park only in brightly lit, busy lots, and the memory of that pale, wet hand pressed against the glass, accompanied by that hideous, clicking imitation of a bark, is enough to keep me from ever seeking true solitude again. The sound of something scraping across metal when you know you are utterly alone. That's a fear you never forget. Story 5. I was on a time-sensitive haul through the mountainous spine of western North Carolina, pushing the limits of my drive time. The route took me close to Lake Fontana, one of those deep, artificial lakes where the mountain roads wind tight and the trees crowd right up to the shoulder. Around midnight, the weather turned against me. Not rain, but fog. A thick, wet, blinding layer that rolled in off the valleys and settled so heavily that my high beams only illuminated a white, impenetrable wall a few feet in front of the hood. I couldn't see the lines, couldn't judge the curve of the road. It was too dangerous to continue, so I had to find somewhere, anywhere, to pull the massive rig off the road. Eventually, I spotted a barely visible dirt track leading sharply downhill. It seemed to service an old, derelict property. I could just make out the silhouette of a shack through the swirling mist. I took the risk, carefully maneuvering the truck down the rutted lane until the ground leveled out. I parked beside an old, moss-covered lake house cabin that looked like it was in the slow, inevitable process of collapsing back into the dense undergrowth. No lights, no other vehicles, no signs of life. Perfect, if slightly unsettling, solitude. I killed the engine, and the silence was immediately complete, broken only by the soft drip, drip, drip of condensation running off the pines. I decided to get out and stretch my legs for a moment before crawling into the sleeper. As soon as I opened the heavy cab door, I was hit by it. A smell. It wasn't the standard damp earth or pine resin of the woods. This was a thick, suffocating stench of decay. It was rotting meat mixed with wet, disturbed earth, and something metallic and sickly sweet. It was so overpowering, so intensely foul, that it felt physical, coating the inside of my mouth. I instinctively grabbed the heavy-duty flashlight from its mount, a powerful beam I rarely needed, and slammed the door shut to keep the smell out of the cab. I swept the beam around the immediate area. The light cut through the dense fog, illuminating a small, overgrown clearing between the cabin and the wall of trees. The smell was strongest right by the back corner of the old lake house, near what looked like a neglected septic access or an old woodshed. I walked slowly toward the back of the cabin, the gravel crunching under my boots, trying to identify the source. A dead animal, maybe? A large deer that wandered up to the back porch to die? The smell was too vast for just one animal. As I neared the corner of the cabin, I saw them. Drag marks. They weren't faint or subtle. They were deep, continuous gouges in the wet, damp earth, clearly made by something heavy and awkward being pulled across the ground. They started near the foundation of the house and led directly, unervingly, into the deepest, darkest part of the woods. They weren't the erratic scrape of a heavy branch being dragged by the wind, either. They were too deliberate, too straight, and wide enough to suggest a massive carcass, or something even larger. My common sense was screaming at me to turn back, to get in the truck and drive, fog or no fog. But the overpowering stench and the sheer mystery of the tracks held me captive. I had to know what had made those marks and what had been left behind. I followed the drag marks for maybe 10 feet into the woods, the beam of my flashlight shaking slightly. The trees grew tighter here, and the low-hanging branches of rhododendron and laurel were already catching the fog, making the area intensely dark and claustrophobic. I paused, shining the light on a thick, low-hanging briar bush that had snagged the dragging object. That's when I saw the hair. Stuck to the thorns of the briar were clumps of matted, coarse black hair. It was thick and wiry, certainly not deer hair, and too dark and heavy to be bear fur. It looked like the rough, primitive hair of some large, shaggy creature, mixed with faint traces of the sticky, red-brown soil. I stared at the hair, my mind running through every possible classification: elk, boar, mountain goat, but none of them fit the density or the texture. And then I heard it. It was a quiet sound, but in the absolute silence of the fog-bound forest, it was deafening. It was a wet chewing sound. It was coming from just beyond a stand of thick laurel bushes, maybe 15 feet away, right where the drag marks disappeared completely. It was a rhythmic, sickening sound of flesh being consumed. A slow, grinding, tearing, and swallowing noise. It wasn't the fast, sharp snapping of a dog or coyote. It was deliberate. It was heavy. It was patient. And interwoven with the wet chewing was a faint, low sound of breathing. A deep, thick, raspy exhalation, almost a shuddering sigh, that suggested a creature of enormous size, completely focused on its task. I didn't need to see it. The smell, now mixed with a sharper, coppery scent, the matted black hair, and that steady, sickening sound of consumption were enough. Whatever was beyond that laurel thicket wasn't scavenging. It was feasting, and judging by the drag marks, it had just brought its prey from the lakeside house clearing and into the darkness to consume it. The chilling realization struck me. I wasn't listening to a natural occurrence. I was listening to a large, intelligent, and predatory being having its dinner, and I was standing right in its path. I turned the powerful beam of my flashlight off instantly, plunging the forest into absolute blackness, terrified that the light would draw its attention. I backed away, slowly, deliberately, forcing myself to step carefully on the soft earth to avoid the sound of crunching gravel. Every breath felt like a scream. Every footfall was a seismic event. I had my heavy tool belt knife, but I knew it would be useless against something capable of dragging a body that heavily. It took what felt like an hour to retrace my 10 steps. I finally stumbled out of the woods and onto the gravel patch next to my massive truck, never once hearing the chewing stop. It was still eating. I scrambled up the steel steps and into the cab, slamming the door shut and locking it with frantic, fumbling haste. I didn't stop to check the air pressure or plot a route. I started the engine, threw the transmission into gear, and drove out of that lot, the massive truck struggling to climb the rutted dirt track in the blinding fog. I didn't care about the risk. I just needed distance. I drove through the blinding, suffocating fog for what felt like eternity, maybe 2 full hours, barely able to see the edge of the road, until the mist finally broke near a major interstate junction. Even then, the thick, cloying stench of rotting meat and wet earth seemed to cling to the inside of my cab, a powerful olfactory memory of the horror I had narrowly escaped. I pulled into the first gas station with floodlights and rushed to wash my face and hands, trying to scrub away the sickening smell. I never did find out what was being consumed or what creature possessed that coarse, black hair. But I know that deep in those North Carolina mountains, in the silent, fog-laden clearings near the forgotten lake houses, there is something monstrous that hunts, drags its kills into the dark, and sits patiently chewing, utterly confident that its terrible silence and the impenetrable fog will protect its meal from human eyes. And the memory of that quiet, wet, sickening sound of consumption still chases me on long, dark stretches of the road. Story 6. The job was a 2-day run delivering high-end construction materials, lumber, specialized glass, and fixtures to a luxury lakeside development going up on the Georgia side of Lake Hartwell. This wasn't one of those easy interstate hauls. It was miles of winding mountain roads, and the final access point was a newly cleared dirt track near the waterfront. I arrived late, the sun already dipping behind the blue ridge, casting long, bruised shadows across the water. Since I couldn't drop the load in the dark without a crew, I decided to wait it out in my sleeper cab. Earlier that day, I'd stopped at a little diner in Anderson, South Carolina, for coffee and got talking to an old fella. He'd mentioned the lake, told me stories about how the whole valley was drowned decades ago, submerging old farmsteads and cemeteries. He pointed a gnarled finger toward the map taped on the wall. "See that?" he rasped, indicating a small, dark speck of land in the middle of a wide section of the lake. "That's Little Island. Used to be the high point of the old church's graveyard. Folks used to dare each other to camp there, back when they were stupid. Nobody does now. They say that island is wrong." I'd scoffed it off as local superstition, the usual Appalachian weirdness you hear on every mountain job. But the old man's eyes were too steady, too serious to be just spinning a yarn. Now, as I shut down my engine, the memory of his warnings settled over me with the heavy quiet of the isolated spot. My truck was parked right on the temporary boat ramp, giving me a clear, unimpeded view across the wide expanse of the dark water. The sky was the blackest velvet, the kind of night where the stars feel too close, and the air was cold and damp, smelling heavily of pine and lake water. I checked the truck locks, pulled the heavy blackout curtains, and tried to settle in, but the coffee from the diner was working against the exhaustion. I lay there for perhaps an hour, staring at the ceiling of the sleeper cab, listening to the tiny, incessant sounds of the truck cooling down. Then I saw it. Directly in the center of the lake, in the approximate location of the island the old man had pointed out, a faint light began to pulse. It wasn't a searchlight. It wasn't the steady massed light of a boat. It was a soft, organic yellow-orange glow, like a bonfire shielded by thick trees, but it possessed a strange, almost rhythmic quality, a subtle pulse like a slow, beating heart. It was emanating directly from the landmass in the center of the lake. I got out of my bunk and crept to the driver's side window, pulling the curtain back an inch to watch. I watched that pulsing light for a good 20 minutes, trying desperately to rationalize it. Hikers? Fishermen stranded on the island? But no hiker builds a fire that glows that low and strangely, and fishermen usually have lights that are white or red and steady. The longer I stared, the more deeply the feeling of cold, quiet dread took root. The light felt like a beacon, but not one meant for navigation. Then, the second element of the horror began. It started as a low, dull thrum, barely audible over the sound of my own anxious breathing. It was sound drifting across the water, and the lake acted like a massive acoustic mirror, carrying the noise with chilling clarity. It was a rhythmic sound, a monotone noise that eventually resolved itself into a sustained, low-frequency sound. Chanting. It was deep, hollow, and absolutely devoid of harmony or warmth. It sounded like dozens of voices, layered on top of each other, repeating a short, simple phrase over and over. But the language, if it was a language, was unrecognizable. It was less like human speech and more like an ancient, powerful drone. I couldn't distinguish a single word, only the terrifying, collective weight of the sound. As I listened, transfixed, the chanting began to grow louder, more urgent, and the pulsing light on the island grew brighter, the soft yellow-orange now bordering on a fierce, hot glare. I could dimly make out the shapes of movement around the light. They were dark figures, swaying and moving in a synchronized rhythm, their silhouettes occasionally crossing the intense glow of the fire. They weren't standing, they were performing a motion that was both rigid and fluid, moving with a disturbing, mechanical uniformity. This was no party. This was no camping trip. This was a ceremony. It felt pure, ancient, and deeply, terribly disturbing. The kind of ritual you read about in forgotten history books, practiced by people who live entirely outside the boundary of modern law and faith. The kind of thing that involves a necessary, silent sacrifice. The sound of the chanting reached a terrible crescendo, a powerful, unified wave of sound that vibrated the thin glass of my cab window. I could feel the drone in my teeth. The figures around the fire were moving faster now, more violently, their shadows flickering and merging into one frantic, enormous shape around the core of the light. I slammed my fist against my leg, fighting the paralyzing terror, desperately trying to focus on something concrete, something to prove this was just a trick of the light and the dark water. And then, just when the sound felt like it was about to overwhelm the entire valley, it stopped. Abruptly, completely. The chanting ceased mid-syllable, cut off as if a massive switch had been thrown. Simultaneously, the intense, unnatural light on the island winked out, plunging the center of the lake back into absolute, light-swallowing blackness. The speed and synchronization of the stop were perhaps the most terrifying part of the entire event. It implied a massive, unified will, a purpose that was complete. A wave of absolute, shocking silence washed over the lake, replacing the oppressive noise. It was the deepest silence I had ever experienced, a vacuum where sound had just been. It pressed down on the truck, on the water, on the land. I stood there, sweat cold on my face, waiting for a sound. Any sound, a shout, a giggle, a retreating boat engine. But there was nothing. Whatever terrible thing had happened on that small, dark island in the middle of Lake Hartwell was now finished. The participants either gone or silent, waiting. And the silence felt less like an absence of sound and more like a heavy presence, a thing actively listening for my reaction. I moved away from the window, dropping the curtain back into place. My hand was shaking so violently I couldn't operate the ignition key. I forced myself to count to 100, trying to regulate my breath. I realized that my presence, my truck, my engine, my light, was a gross intrusion on something primal and hidden. Whatever the locals called wrong about that island was actively participating in something horrifying in the dead of night, and the last thing I wanted was for the collective attention of that ritual to turn toward the shore. I quietly gathered my wallet and keys. I didn't hook up my airline or check my tires. I didn't even bother to open the cab door to look outside. I simply turned the key, started the engine, and with agonizing control, maneuvered the rig off the gravel and back onto the winding, dark road. I left the entire $150,000 load of construction materials sitting right there by the waterfront, a perfect offering to whatever gods or rituals governed that water. I drove out of there hard, not looking in the rearview mirror until I was 10 miles away, back on the well-paved highway, where the lights of civilization finally offered some weak reassurance. I couldn't shake the image of those swaying, silent shapes around the pulsing light, or the sound of that deep, hollow, ancient drone. The only thing I knew for certain was that whatever happened on Little Island in the darkest hour of the night was something no one, especially not a tired trucker, was meant to witness. And that terrifying, listening silence still haunts me whenever I pull over near a body of water in the mountains. Story 7. The job took me deeper into the Monongahela National Forest than I had ever been before. It was a contract hauling construction supplies, sheetrock, piping, and specialized insulation to renovate a collection of old, private lake houses scattered around a remote, unnamed reservoir. The roads leading in were barely marked fire trails, winding through miles of dense, unbroken wilderness. Cell service died 10 miles back, and I hadn't seen another car for over an hour. When I finally found the site, it was a ghost camp. 5 or 6 dilapidated, salt box cabins huddled near the water, their peeling paint barely visible in the dark. My big rig was the only thing with an engine for what felt like 50 square miles. I parked the truck as close as possible to the central clearing, right beside one of the derelict rental cabins. The air was cold, damp, and smelled overwhelmingly of old timber and moss. The quiet was heavy, the kind of silence that feels less like peace and more like a vacuum, waiting to be filled by something terrifying. I checked the load, set the air brakes, and, after triple-checking the cab doors, crawled into the sleeper bunk. Despite the grueling drive, sleep was elusive. The oppressive darkness outside, the immense isolation, and the sheer silence kept me on edge. Around 4 a.m., the absolute lowest point of the night, I was finally drifting off when a sudden, jarring noise from the trailer snapped me wide awake. It was a heavy, dull thwack followed by a persistent flap, flap, flap. One of the thick tarps covering the insulation load had come loose in the shifting temperature, and the stiff canvas was whipping against the side of the trailer in the slight breeze. I knew I couldn't leave it. It would shred the canvas and soak the insulation before dawn. Cursing softly, I grabbed my keys, slipped on my boots, and stepped reluctantly out of the cab. The cold air hit me immediately. I walked slowly around the cab and toward the front of the trailer. I had just reached the nose of the load, beginning to wrestle with the heavy nylon rope, when I stopped dead. I heard a sound that didn't belong to the wind or the tarp. It was a soft, steady scraping sound. It was coming from the adjacent cabin, the derelict rental that stood maybe 20 feet from my truck sleeper cab. Scrape, scrape. It was too slow and too deliberate to be a branch rubbing the siding. It sounded like something hard and heavy being drawn across rough wood or glass. I froze, holding my breath, the rope slack in my hands. I listened hard. The scraping paused and then resumed, definitely originating from the front of the cabin, specifically near the lowest window, close to the ground. My initial thought was some sort of animal, a porcupine or maybe a massive raccoon trying to get at something inside. But the movement felt wrong, too controlled, too patient. I slowly released the tarp rope and reached for my powerful, handheld LED flashlight, the cold aluminum slick in my grasp. I knew I was making a terrible mistake by investigating, but the scraping was persistent, and the idea of some wild animal getting inside those old cabins felt like a hazard I needed to identify. I turned slowly, deliberately, pivoting toward the sound. I brought the flashlight up and flicked the beam on, cutting a brilliant, surgical cone through the oppressive gloom. I moved the light cautiously toward the source of the noise. The scraping abruptly stopped the instant the light hit the cabin wall. The beam landed on the front window, a small, square pane set low on the structure, covered in grime and cobwebs. My blood ran cold, instantly draining all warmth from my extremities, leaving me numb and lightheaded. Pressed flat against the grime-covered glass, looking directly out at me, was a face. It was positioned low on the window, perfectly centered, staring out into the beam of light without blinking. It wasn't human. It was horrifyingly pale, almost bone-white, and completely hairless. The skin looked thin and slick like stretched-out dough. But the eyes were the worst part. They were immense, black, and glossy. Two enormous, unblinking pools that reflected the LED light like polished obsidian discs. They seemed too large for the skull, dominating the face. The mouth was what truly sealed the terror. It was stretched into a terrible, silent, too wide grimace that extended far past the normal boundaries of a human face. It wasn't a smile of humor or even malice. It was a grotesque, stretched-out rictus that conveyed nothing but pure, cold emptiness. It was utterly silent, utterly motionless, just pressed flat against the glass, looking at me. I stood there, paralyzed, holding the light steady on its horrific face. It didn't try to knock, or scratch, or force its way out. It simply held that position, its wide, dark eyes drilling into mine. It felt less like an encounter and more like a detailed, silent inspection. The air around me suddenly felt frigid, intensely cold, a temperature drop that had nothing to do with the early morning chill. I knew with absolute, terrifying certainty that this thing had not been startled by the light. It had been waiting for the light. It had been making that soft, scraping noise deliberately, a subtle lure, trying to draw me out and into its line of sight. It was observing me, gauging my size, my fear, my reaction. It was studying my vulnerability. The paralysis finally broke. I didn't turn and run in a panic. I simply stumbled backward, pulling the light beam off the window. I scrambled blindly back toward the open door of my cab, tripping on the steel steps in my haste. I yanked the heavy door shut, slammed the lock down, and then threw the secondary bolt. I reached for the ignition, but something told me not to start the engine, not to make any noise that would confirm its prey was escaping. I didn't turn around. I fell back into the sleeper bunk and kept my eyes glued to the rearview mirror, which offered a sliver of reflection of the cabin window. For hours, I lay there, rigid, watching the glass. I expected to see a shadow move in the darkness, or hear the terrifying sound of those large claws scraping on the metal of my truck. But there was nothing, just the silence. It remained motionless, staring out from the darkness into the first, slow hours of the morning. As the sky outside began to turn a sickly, pale gray, the face was still there, a silent, pale phantom pressed against the glass, until the increasing light finally started to wash out its features. With the rising sun, the thing seemed to recede, dissolving back into the black shadows of the cabin interior, vanishing as if it were never there. I started the engine the moment the sun broke the tree lean. I didn't adjust the tarp. I didn't check the load. I drove that massive rig out of Monongahela at a speed that was borderline dangerous, not stopping until I hit the nearest major town with a cell signal. I called the client, mumbled something about the road being impassable, and quit the contract on the spot. That face, the flat, pale skin, the huge, black, unblinking eyes, and that terrible, silent smile is still burned into the deepest part of my memory. It wasn't a monster of rage or hunger. It was a creature of pure, cold observation, existing in the dark, waiting for someone to be vulnerable enough to stand still in its presence. I know, without a shadow of a doubt, that it still lives in that derelict cabin, pressing itself against the glass, just waiting for the next tired soul to pull off the road and give it something new to watch. And I will never, ever forget the moment its chilling, vacant gaze settled upon me. Story 8. I was making a long haul through West Virginia, running ahead of schedule, which meant I had the luxury of finding a real pull-off for the night. I was driving near Tigert Lake, one of those deep, expansive reservoirs carved into mountains, and spotted a faded sign for a public boat launch. It was a secluded spot, a wide gravel and asphalt lot right by the water, perfect for pulling my rig completely off the main road. The night was overcast, heavy with cloud cover, and absolutely silent save for the faint, steady slap, slap, slap of the lake water gently folding against the low concrete barrier of the ramp. I locked the doors, drew the curtains, and was already halfway to a deep sleep by the time I settled into the bunk. I had been asleep for maybe an hour when the first sound woke me up. It was a dull, heavy thud directly on the roof of the sleeper cab right above my head. It sounded like someone had dropped a baseball-sized rock onto the metal. I was instantly awake and immediately annoyed. My first thought was local teenagers. You get that sometimes, isolated places, bored kids, and a giant truck to mess with. I lay still listening. Silence. I pulled the curtain back an inch and peered out. The lot was empty. No headlights. No movement. Just the truck and the vast, oppressive darkness. I was about to dismiss it and try to settle back down when it happened again. Thud. This one was slightly heavier, hitting the metal with a deeper resonance, making the structure of the cab vibrate. This wasn't a practical joke. This was intentional. I sat up in the bunk, adrenaline spiking. I quietly slipped on my jeans and reached for the glove compartment, pulling out the weight and cold comfort of my heavy handgun. If it was teenagers, they were about to get a serious scare and a call to the sheriff. I waited, listening to the silence, ready to swing open the door. I counted 60 seconds. Nothing. I started to think I was overreacting, that maybe some debris had fallen from a low branch. But then the sound returned, and it was 1,000 times worse. It wasn't a single thud. It was a sudden, violent volley of small stones. They hit the back of the trailer first, a rapid, frantic rat-a-tat-tat that sounded like heavy rain on sheet metal. Then the storm moved forward. They peppered the sides of the cab, then the hood, and finally a barrage of sharp, high-pitched pings struck the thick laminated glass of the windshield. It wasn't rain or hail. The rhythm was all wrong. It was fast, relentless, and unervingly deliberate, like dozens of people throwing small, hard objects at once, but with impossible speed and accuracy. The noise was deafening inside the cab, and I could feel the truck shuddering under the sheer number of impacts. My mind instantly discarded the idea of teenagers. No group of kids could organize and throw with that much violence and precision from the dark. This was something else, something frantic, something trying to drive me out of the truck. I lowered my head quickly below the level of the windows, fearing that the continuous impact would eventually breach the glass. I scrambled toward the driver's seat, handgun now gripped firmly in my hand. My eyes darted to the driver's side mirror. It was set to look back along the length of the trailer, and the powerful red side markers provided just enough light to illuminate the adjacent slope. That's when I saw the movement. Just at the edge of the woods, where the slope rose sharply above the parking lot, I saw a low, wide shadow darting rapidly between the dense cover of the rhododendron bushes and pines. It was a shape that moved too fast, too low, and too fluidly to be human, and it was the source of the relentless barrage. It wasn't one figure. It was a vague, dark mass of movement, a low, wide creature, or maybe multiple intertwined creatures that was scooping and hurling the gravel and stones with incredible velocity from the dark cover. The sound of impacts intensified around me, a frantic, desperate drumming against the metal. I didn't need to see its face to know it was hostile, intelligent, and focused on driving me out of the machine. Its coordination, the sheer volume of material being thrown, and the absolute lack of self-preservation told me that whatever it was not operating on human fear or logic. It was a siege. I threw the keys into the ignition, my hands slick with terror, and cranked the massive engine. The diesel roared to life, shattering the night again. I slammed the transmission into gear, released the air brakes, and floored the accelerator pedal, the huge tires spitting the very same gravel the creature was using as ammunition. I drove out of that boat launch parking lot like a missile, swerving wildly, the truck rattling violently over the rough ground. I didn't dare slow down, convinced that if I stopped, the creature would somehow manage to climb onto the rig. Even as I hit the main highway, running every stop sign and ignoring the legal speed limit, the frantic drumming continued on the back of the trailer and the roof of the sleeper, a final, chilling, percussive assault. The thing was still chasing, or maybe it was still throwing from the top of the slope, the momentum of my vehicle just carrying the stones forward. I reached 70 miles per hour, then 80. Only after a solid 5 minutes of hard, sustained driving did the horrible, rhythmic drumming against the metal finally, abruptly stop. The overwhelming sounds of my own engine and the rush of the wind were all that remained. I didn't pull over again until I was 40 miles down the road and completely out of the Tigert Lake area, stopping only at a brightly lit rest area full of other travelers. When I finally climbed out, shaking, I examined the truck under the harsh fluorescent lights. The paintwork was pitted and chipped all along the driver's side and the back of the sleeper, looking like it had been blasted by a shotgun of gravel. Whatever was hiding on that slope above the lake wasn't trying to scare me. It was trying to disable my vehicle and draw me into the dark, using a cunning, unrelenting tactic. The memory of that low, wide shadow darting through the trees, throwing projectile after projectile with impossible strength and accuracy, still haunts me. It wasn't a person, and it wasn't a wild animal. It was something elemental and focused, something that saw my big, noisy rig as an offense to its dark, Appalachian territory, and it decided to stone me out of existence. I never again pulled off the highway anywhere near a mountain lake in West Virginia. The sound of rain on metal will never be innocent to me again. Story 9. The last leg of the haul was a nightmare. A delivery of specialized kitchen equipment to a new retreat center being built deep in the Ozarks, near Beaver Lake in Arkansas. The instructions were vague. The roads were barely maintained. And by the time I finally reached the property, the sun had set and a massive thunderstorm had just cleared, leaving the air heavy and the ground utterly soaked. I was running hours behind and had to pull the big rig off the main delivery path onto a small, muddy gravel apron near the water. Right there, practically leaning into the lake, was a rickety old lake house, dark and clearly vacant. I figured I'd wait out the mandatory rest period, make the drop at first light, and get out before the mud turned into a total disaster. I shut down the engine, and the silence was immediately thick, broken only by the steady dripping of residual rain from the pines and the heavy scent of ozone and wet earth. I checked all the usual locks, pulled the heavy curtains, and was asleep within minutes, the exhaustion of the long drive winning out over the unsettling quiet of the deep woods. I woke up naturally around 6 a.m., the sky turning a soft, bruised gray. I felt rested, but there was an unpleasant tension in the air, a leftover chill from the storm and the absolute isolation. My first task was to assess the mud situation before attempting to move the 18-wheeler. I swung the cab door open, climbed down the steep steps, and immediately my eyes landed on something that made me freeze with my boots halfway to the ground. Right beside the large, twin fuel tanks on the driver's side, impressed perfectly into the soft, freshly wet mud, was a footprint. It was massive, easily 3 times the size of my own size 12 boot, but size wasn't the disturbing part, it was the structure. It was not the print of a boot, a shoe, or any kind of conventional footwear. The shape was long, narrow through the heel, and clearly articulated with 3 heavy, blunt-tipped toes. The impression was deep, indicating enormous weight, and the displacement of the mud was absolute, not like a clumsy animal, but like a creature designed for bipedal movement. There was no sign of a 4th or 5th toe, no subtle arch of a human foot, just that terrible 3-pronged impression. My blood turned to ice. I carefully stepped around the print and followed the trail, my sense of relief about being rested completely evaporating, replaced by a cold, growing horror. The track started at the edge of the dense woods, where the old, vacant lake house sat leaning into the trees. They ran in an unervingly straight line, ignoring the small obstacles of roots and rocks, right up to the side of my massive rig. I walked the perimeter of the truck, following the terrifying path. The thing had circled the entire front half of the 18-wheeler. There were prints directly under the massive aluminum air filter casing, prints right beside the driver's steps, and a series of prints that curved around the front bumper, indicating the creature had moved right in front of the engine block. It had walked slow, methodical laps around my temporary refuge while I was sound asleep just inches above it. The prints showed incredible detail. The skin seemed to have a rough, pebbled texture, and where the pads of the toes pressed deepest into the mud, there was a faint, raised ridge, almost like a callus. The step pattern wasn't the long, awkward stride of an ape or bear. It was a deliberate, smooth walk, like a massive human, only with this impossible, three-toed structure. I looked at the window of my sleeper cab, then down at the closest track, and the sheer scale of the creature that must have been standing there, studying the truck, was paralyzing. If its footprint was that long, the thing that made it must have stood easily 7 or 8 feet tall, maybe more, and carried immense weight. And it had spent the dark hours of the early morning circling my machine, completely silent, utterly unseen. I finished tracing the perimeter. The prints, having completed their circuit of the truck, led back toward the woods, away from the delivery path, and directly toward the black, unmoving surface of Beaver Lake. I followed them a few yards into the dense growth, a terrible compulsion overriding my good sense. The ground here was softer, muddier, and the prints sank deeper, leaving perfect, ancient-looking molds in the earth. The silence of the woods felt malevolent, heavy with things that move only when the sun is down. I stopped abruptly when the trail ended at the base of a huge, moss-covered oak tree. The tracks didn't go around the tree. They simply stopped. There were no prints leading away in any direction. No drag marks, no scuffle, no signs of the creature having suddenly taken flight. It was as if the thing had reached the base of that massive trunk and simply vanished, either stepping off the ground into the thick canopy or melting into the very wood itself. The sheer impossibility of the ending to the trail sent a shockwave of cold, pure panic through me. This wasn't an animal that simply walked through the area. This was something that existed here, something that had materialized from the woods to inspect me, and then simply retreated back into the unseeable world. I didn't need to see the creature itself. The sheer, alien nature of those tracks, combined with the fact that it had spent hours stalking my cab, was enough evidence for a lifetime. I backed out of the woods slowly, reverently stepping only on the old, dry pine needles, careful not to disturb the terrifying evidence it had left behind. I scrambled back into the cab. The delivery, previously urgent, was now the only escape route I could justify. I cranked the engine, my hands shaking so badly I almost ground the gears. I made the drop-off as fast as humanly possible, tossing the bill of lading at the first construction foreman I saw, offering no explanation for my frantic speed. I drove out of the Beaver Lake region, running every piece of safety advice I knew. I didn't stop for coffee, I didn't stop for gas, and I certainly didn't stop to rest until the landscape flattened out and the mountains were nothing but a faint blue smudge in my rearview mirror. Even today, years later, the sight of fresh, wet mud in a secluded spot will give me a nauseating spike of adrenaline. The Ozarks hold more secrets than any person should ever uncover. And I know that somewhere in those quiet, damp forests near that lonely lake house, that massive, three-toed creature still walks its ancient, patient circuit, leaving behind the horrifying, impossible proof that something enormous and unseen lives in the deep woods, silently studying us while we sleep. The only thing I have left is the terrible knowledge of the tracks it made, tracks that confirmed I had been watched, observed, and permitted to leave. Story 10. The layover was mandatory, a 2-day break dictated by the company after a grueling 3-week cross-country haul. I opted for the cheapest, most isolated option I could find, a tiny private rental cabin deep in the rural mountains of North Carolina, tucked away beside a small, man-made lake. The place was exactly what the price suggested. Dilapidated, leaning slightly toward the water, with peeling linoleum and a permanent, heavy smell of mildew and damp earth. My truck was parked awkwardly in the overgrown drive, the only sign of modern life for miles. I didn't care about the condition. I just needed a bed that wasn't a narrow bunk and 4 walls that weren't metal. The first 2 nights, I slept soundly, the deep, exhausted sleep of a man running on reserve. The silence of the mountains felt like a welcome blanket, oppressive but reassuringly empty. It was the 3rd night, after I'd finally started to relax, that the silence turned into something else. I was woken up, not by a jolt, but by a sound that had been slowly working its way into my subconscious. It was faint, muffled, but deeply resonant. It was a rhythmic, dull sound coming from directly beneath the floorboards of the bedroom. Thump, thump, thump. I sat up in the old, saga bed, straining my ears in the absolute darkness. The sound was slow, steady, and incredibly heavy. It was too regular to be an animal rooting around. A raccoon, a possum, or even a bear would move with a random scattering of noise. This was deliberate. It was moving at the pace of a slow, massive heartbeat, resonating right up through the thin floorboards and into the structure of the bed frame. The sound was coming from the crawl space, that shallow, dark void between the foundation and the floor. Thump, thump, thump. I grabbed my phone, not to call anyone. I knew the service was non-existent, but for the small, pathetic comfort of a light source. The rhythmic impact was so powerful that I could feel a low-frequency vibration in the bed itself, a subtle, constant shuddering that spoke of immense, heavy weight moving just beneath my feet. I climbed out of bed, moving with agonizing slowness, and pressed my ear to the cold, thin floor. The sound intensified. It was a dense, dull impact, like a heavy, waterlogged mass being slowly lowered to the dirt, then lifted, then lowered again. The rhythm never changed. Thump, pause, thump, pause, thump. It sounded exactly like a massive, heavy heart beating under the house, or perhaps a creature walking on 3 limbs, using a 4th, heavy stump for support. The sound continued for what felt like an eternity, maybe 15 minutes, without deviation or acceleration. It was the most disturbing sound I'd ever heard precisely because of its utter lack of panic or haste. It suggested a creature of terrible patience and overwhelming size, moving slowly, methodically, in the damp, dark space just beneath the cabin. Then, the thumping stopped. The silence that replaced it was immediate and crushing. I stood there, frozen in the dark, waiting for the thump to resume, or for the silence to be broken by a scrape or a growl. A minute passed. 2 minutes. My breath was trapped in my chest, burning my lungs. Then the sound came again, but it was different. It wasn't the slow thump of heavy motion. It was a horrible, moist, scraping noise. It started directly beneath the spot where I had been standing, right below the bedroom floor. It was the sound of something dragging a heavy, waterlogged limb or a rough, bony projection across the damp dirt floor of the crawl space. And it was moving, slowly, painfully slowly. The sickening scrape moved out from beneath the bed and began to traverse the entire length of the cabin floor, tracking toward the front door. I backed away silently, stumbling against the dresser, my eyes wide in the blackness. The scraping sound was continuous, suggesting a creature moving its mass on its belly or dragging a debilitating injury. It crossed the small dining area, moved into the center of the tiny living room, and then, with agonizing slowness, stopped directly beneath the front door of the cabin. The only thing separating me from the creature now was the thin, rotting wood floor, and my weight resting on it felt like an invitation. The scraping stopped, replaced by a deep, thick, raspy silence, heavier and more focused than before. It was absolutely still, and I knew, with the cold certainty of a hunted thing, that it had stopped right there, because it had detected my presence. It was listening, waiting for me to move, to betray my position. The terrifying thought struck me. The initial thumping hadn't been movement at all. It had been the creature making a kind of signal, or perhaps simply resting its bulk, and the scraping was its method of stalking, of silently repositioning itself toward the source of the heat and noise. It was now directly beneath the strongest part of the floor, where the main entryway was supported. I spent the next 3 hours sitting absolutely still against the bedroom wall, far from the front door. I didn't dare turn on the phone light, didn't dare take a full breath. Every nerve ending was hyper-alert, listening for any shift in the soundscape. I was convinced that if I stood up, if I put my full weight down, or made any sudden noise, the creature, which was immense and clearly powerful, would realize I was awake and actively try to force its way through the floor or through the door frame, which was only a few feet away. I imagined the damp, bone-white skin, the heavy, dragging limbs, and the sheer force contained in that slow, rhythmic movement, all poised beneath the cheap floorboards. I remained rooted there until the first sliver of weak, gray dawn light appeared in the cracked window. As the sun rose higher, the terrible silence beneath the floor persisted, but the light brought with it the faintest, most blessed sounds of the outside world. A distant bird call, the soft ripple of the lake. I waited another half hour, the adrenaline finally starting to recede, leaving me weak and sick. I moved only when the sun was fully up. I grabbed my clothes and my keys, packed only the essentials, and threw a wad of cash onto the mildewed counter, far more than the rent was worth. I walked across the living room with the terrified, silent grace of a ghost, never stepping near the front door. I unlocked the back porch door, the one facing the lake, and slipped out, running to my truck without looking back. I never checked the crawl space. I never looked under the house to see the source of that heavy, methodical thump or the evidence of the moist, awful scrape. I started the engine and drove out of that mountain valley, not stopping for anything. I know, without needing to see it, that the creature is still there, living in the damp, undisturbed dark beneath that cabin, waiting for the next hired traveler to seek refuge and provide a warm, rhythmic presence directly above its head. And the fear I carry is the chilling knowledge that I spent an entire night separated from an enormous, predatory horror by only a few inches of rotting wood. And the worst sound was the sound it made when it stopped moving and started to listen. Story 11. The layover was unexpected. I was hauling specialized structural steel for a high-end, isolated hunting lodge being built deep within the Allegheny Mountains of western Pennsylvania. The crew was delayed, and I was told to park the rig on the property line and wait until morning. The property was immense, a large tract of untouched forest surrounding a small, private lake, and my truck was the only thing for miles. I pulled off the dirt access road into a wide, newly cleared turnaround near the shore, shut down the roaring diesel, and settled in for the night. The air was clear and cold, with a sharp bite that hinted at the coming winter, and the sky was a deep, intense black dusted with brilliant stars. I had been asleep for maybe 2 hours, locked in the deep, heavy exhaustion of the road, when a sound snagged me back to consciousness. It was faint, high-pitched, and incredibly clear, cutting through the vast silence of the mountain night. It was whistling, not a tune, not a recognizable song, but a high, sustained, clear note that descended slowly into a lower tone, repeating the pattern every few seconds. It sounded mournful and repetitive, like a signal being sent across a vast distance. It was coming from the woods across the lake, maybe a quarter-mile away, the water carrying the sound with an eerie clarity. I lay still, trying to rationalize it. A strange night bird, perhaps? Though I'd never heard an owl or a hawk make such a clear, consistent sound. Or maybe an eccentric hiker or hunter camped out on the far side of the water, bored and signaling to himself. I tried to dismiss it, pulling the thick blanket higher, but the regularity of the whistling made it impossible to ignore. Wee-oh, wee-oh. I watched the clock on the dashboard slowly click forward. The whistling continued, unchanging, for another 10 minutes. It felt less and less like an accidental noise and more like a deliberate, directed sound. A signal. Then the sound changed. The high, clear note abruptly dropped, becoming lower, more guttural, and acquiring an unpleasant, rasping quality. It was still recognizable as whistling, but it was corrupted, warped. It started to sound eerily like a human trying to imitate a siren or a distress call, but failing, the sound catching deep in the throat before being forced out. It was a sound of immense, controlled effort, and it was profoundly unnerving. And then the sound moved. The guttural whistling was no longer static across the lake. It was moving rapidly around the perimeter of the property. One moment, it was far to the east, and the next, it was close, right at the boundary of the woods to the north. Whatever was making the sound was covering ground with impossible speed, circumnavigating the immediate clearing where my truck was parked. I was paralyzed, sweat breaking out on my forehead despite the cold cab. I slid silently out of the bunk and crept to the driver's seat. I carefully pulled the blackout curtain back just enough to peer into the inky darkness, but my headlights were off, and the moonlight was too weak to penetrate the dense forest edge. The sound was now moving along the line of the trees to the west. Closer still, the guttural whistle vibrating through the air. I held my breath, listening, trying to impose logic on the impossibility. Was it multiple individuals? Some sort of organized feral group? But the sound was always singular, and the movement was too fluid, too fast for any person or even a group scrambling through the undergrowth. It sounded like one massive thing, or one small thing moving with incomprehensible speed. Then, the whistling stopped its circuit and came straight for the truck. In the span of maybe 15 seconds, the sound went from the woods line to right behind the trailer. The final, low, rasping whistle was so close it vibrated the glass of the back window. It sounded less like a whistle and more like a forced, wet exhalation of air through an unnaturally small opening. The air outside felt suddenly charged, intensely focused. The creature was behind the trailer, massive and silent, and I knew it was looking directly at the back of my sleeper cab. It wasn't circling anymore. It was examining the load, the machine, the space where I was sleeping. I gripped the heavy-duty hunting knife I kept sheathed beside the seat, my knuckles white, heart hammering against my ribs like a fist. I kept my eyes fixed on the rearview mirror, but the trailer was too massive, the darkness too absolute. I couldn't have moved for a minute. Then, just as my nerves felt like they were about to snap, the sound came again, but differently. It was not a whistle. It was a low, soft, thick exhale, a human-sounding breath, but magnified, wet, and heavy. It sounded like a massive creature letting out a slow, deliberate sigh. And it was right outside my driver's side window. The creature had moved with total, horrifying silence from the back of the trailer to the side of the cab, all without making a sound of footsteps, breaking a twig, or crunching a single pine needle. It was standing inches from my head, separated by only the thin glass and metal of the door, and it was deliberately letting me know it was there. It knew I was awake. It knew I was listening. That breath felt like a profound, chilling violation. It wasn't the sound of an animal. It was the sound of an intelligent, predatory being establishing contact, signaling that the hunt had begun and that it was in charge of the conversation. I froze, locked in a silence I dared not break. I didn't reach for the keys. The light and noise of the engine would have instantly revealed my precise location and confirmed my panic. I sat there, knife in hand, staring into the dark side curtain, convinced that any moment I would hear the sound of rough hands or massive claws tearing at the door handle, or the terrible, guttural whistling start again, right in my ear. The minutes stretched into hours of absolute, psychological siege. The creature never moved. It never whistled again. It just maintained that terrible, cold silence. Its presence an immense, watchful weight outside the thin metal shell of the cab. I didn't breathe until the first faint sliver of pale, dirty sunlight managed to filter over the eastern ridges. As the light grew, the heavy presence outside slowly began to lift. The air felt less constrained, the silence less threatening. I finally dared to pull the curtain back. I checked the ground below the window. Nothing. No tracks, no prints, no disturbance in the pine needles. Whatever it was, it left no trace. I didn't waste a second. I started the engine, threw the transmission into gear, and drove that heavy load straight onto the construction site, not bothering to check in with dispatch or the crew foreman. I made the drop, drove out of the Allegheny Mountains, and didn't stop until I was hundreds of miles away. I never returned for another haul to that region. I know what I heard. That low, Mournful, guttural whistling was a lure, a trap, and the final, wet breath outside my window was the terrifying moment a cold, ancient intelligence realized I was inside, waiting for me to make the mistake of stepping out. I will never forget that sound, or the terrifying silence that followed when the hunt went quiet. Story 12. The exhaustion was a physical, burning weight behind my eyes, and I knew I couldn't push the rig another mile without risking falling asleep at the wheel. I was just outside the sprawl of Chattanooga, Tennessee, on the last leg of a nightmare run from Texas. I needed an hour, maybe two, of absolute deep sleep. I spotted a narrow, barely marked access road that led down to what looked like an abandoned lakeside property, the kind of place locals used to call the Point. I pulled the massive truck down the track until I hit a wide, flat clearing right by the water. The air was heavy and still, thick with the scent of pine and stagnant lake water. The house itself was spooky, an old two-story structure with all the windows haphazardly boarded up, giving it a blind, derelict look. But the gravel lot was flat, and it was entirely off the main road. Perfect. I killed the roaring engine. The subsequent silence immediately oppressive and vast. I ran through my checklist. Doors locked, curtains drawn, phone on the charger, no signal naturally. I cracked the window just a sliver for air and dropped into the bunk, instantly plunging into a heavy, desperate sleep. I don't know how long I was out, but the shift from sleep to total, wide-awake panic was instantaneous. I was jerked back to consciousness by a sound that cut straight through the dense layers of sleep and dread. It was the sound of my driver's side door handle moving. Not a vibration from the truck settling, not the wind tugging at the door, but the distinct, terrifying click of the locking mechanism being pulled. The external handle was being pressed down, hard and fast. Click-clack, click-clack. I sat straight up in a narrow bunk, my heart slamming against my ribs with a force that felt like it would break bone. All my doors were locked. I double-checked them every time I stopped. I sat motionless, straining to hear over the pounding in my ears. The movement stopped for maybe 2 seconds, and then it resumed, the slow, deliberate depression of the handle. I could hear the mechanism fighting the internal lock I had set. The handle would depress, hesitate as the locking claw met resistance, and then release with a soft, metallic thunk. It would depress again. I couldn't see anything through the heavy blackout curtain, but I could feel it. A heavy, palpable presence right outside the thin, aluminum door. It wasn't the tentative presence of a curious person or a nervous animal. It was the confident, patient weight of something that fully expected the door to open. The metal of the door felt paper-thin, offering no protection at all against the malevolence I sensed just beyond it. My first thought was to reach for my flashlight or my sidearm, but I was terrified that any sudden movement, any noise, would provoke the thing outside. So I moved with agonizing slowness, my hand crawling across the dash until my fingers brushed the toggle for the high beams. My plan was simple: shock it with light, see what it was, and only then decide whether to start the engine and flee. With a surge of adrenaline, I slapped the switch down. The twin megawatt high beams of the 18-wheeler flared to life, flooding the immediate area with a brilliant, blinding white light. The light was so powerful it turned the dark clearing into an unnatural, stark landscape. And the area was empty. My breath hitched. The entire driver's side of the truck, the steps, the gravel apron, all of it was clear. There was no one standing there, no kids, no hulking figure, no shadow. The door handle was still. The surface of the asphalt reflected clean and bright in the glare. But the light hadn't been on for more than 3 seconds before I saw the thing that made my gut seize up. Just as I was reaching to turn the lights off, convinced I had hallucinated the whole thing, I noticed a patch of thick, oily condensation on the door window, right where a face would have been pressed. The glass was cold and the outside air was damp, but there wasn't a general fogging of the glass, just a distinct localized patch, as if something large and warm had been breathing heavily against the glass for a long time. And centered in the middle of that thick, disturbing condensation was a faint, perfect imprint. It was a handprint. It was immense, easily twice the size of my own hand, and completely alien. It clearly showed 3 thick, long fingers terminating in what looked like heavy, blunt claws and a thick, heavy pad where the palm would be. It wasn't a glove print. It wasn't a shoe print. It was the impression of an enormous, 3-fingered hand, and the claws had left a tiny, faint drag mark on the condensation where the creature had pulled its hand back right before I hit the lights. My mind raced, reeling from the impossibility. Whatever had been trying to open my door had been close enough to fog the cold glass with its warm, heavy breath. It had been inches from my head, and it was certainly not human. The terrifying silence outside suddenly felt overwhelming again, but now it was a listening silence. The creature hadn't fled. It had merely stepped back out of the immediate beam of the light, knowing that the dense foliage just a few feet away would swallow its bulk completely. It was still out there, huge and 3-fingered, watching the truck. I reached for the light switch again, but hesitated. Turning the high beams off would plunge me back into the absolute darkness it favored, inviting it back to the door. Leaving them on, however, would keep me a captive in a bright metal box, unable to move. I chose movement. With one decisive, panicked motion, I hit the air brake release, threw the transmission into gear, and slammed the accelerator to the floor. The massive diesel roared, and the truck leaped forward, spitting gravel and dirt across the clearing. I didn't stop to maneuver properly. I simply aimed the rig toward the access road and plowed through the underbrush, smashing through low branches as I fled. I didn't turn the high beams off for miles, leaving them on as a desperate shield. I kept glancing at the driver's side window, and in the harsh reflection of the dash lights, I could still see the pale, faint outline of that giant, 3-fingered handprint in the condensation. I drove out of the Chattanooga area and didn't stop again for 12 straight hours. Not for fuel, not for coffee, not even for a bathroom break. The image of that handprint, wet and chilling on the inside of the glass, is burned into my memory forever. I know the Appalachian hills hold things that defy logic. Creatures evolved in the isolation of the deep woods. Whatever it was, feral, ancient, or something entirely alien, it was methodical, patient, and strong enough to try and force the door of an 18-wheeler. And the sheer, icy horror of knowing that a cold, clawed hand was patiently trying to let itself in while I slept is a feeling I will carry with me every time I pull over for the night. I still have to fight the urge to check the locks 3 or 4 times before I finally allow myself to close my eyes. Story 13. The job had taken me deep into the Ozark Mountains of Missouri, a haul of specialized machinery meant for a private family compound nestled between 2 man-made lakes. The roads were already bad, narrow, winding, and poorly surfaced, but the final stretch was barely more than a gravel trail. I was creeping along, the massive truck groaning with the effort, when I reached a small, crumbling, 1-lane stone bridge. Just as I started to edge onto it, I saw an old, beat-up pickup truck heading my way from the other side. There was no room for us both, so I set the air brakes, killed the engine, and decided to wait for the local to clear the crossing. The silence that rushed in was immediate and absolute, a profound quiet broken only by the settling metal of the truck and the slow, heavy drip of water somewhere down in the creek below the bridge. I decided to use the weight to stretch my legs. I grabbed a water bottle and climbed out of the cab, leaning against the warm hood of the diesel engine. The air was cool, damp, and smelled strongly of wet limestone and pine resin. I scanned the woods, enjoying the temporary solitude, the kind of deep, isolated peace you rarely find. That's when I saw it. About 50 feet into the dense scrub, half hidden behind a thick cluster of rhododendron bushes, was a patch of white. It was too pale to be the gray limestone of the mountains, too smooth and uniform to be a dead piece of timber. It stood out against the rich, dark greens and browns of the forest floor with a disturbing, almost fluorescent intensity. Something, not curiosity, but a terrible cold compulsion, drew my attention toward it, telling me I had to get a closer look. I walked slowly off the gravel, stepping carefully through the ferns and low growth, the sound of my boots on the soft earth muffled by the dampness. As I got closer, the shape resolved itself. It wasn't a piece of white plastic or a dropped item of clothing. It was a bone, My breath hitched in my throat. It was massive, easily 1.5 feet long, and stood partially upright, snagged on the low branches of the bush. It was curved and thick, clearly identifiable as a femur, but scaled up to a size that defied anything I'd ever seen come out of these woods. It was far thicker and heavier than the thigh bone of any deer, cow, or even a very large bear. The bone was perfectly clean, bleached, white, and smooth, looking almost polished. There were no traces of tissue, blood, or decay. It looked like it had been scraped clean only recently, meticulously and utterly. I stood there, staring down at this horrifying, impossible artifact, trying to rationalize it as a joke, a prop, or a very sick animal bone that had been strangely preserved. But the smooth, perfect curve of it, the unnerving density it suggested, settled a cold, profound dread deep in my stomach. I made the terrible decision to touch it. I reached down, my hand trembling slightly, and grasped the bone. It was heavier than it should have been, possessing a strange, cold density that shocked me. The surface was smooth, slightly greasy, and unnaturally cold to the touch. As my fingers closed around the solid mass, the bone clicked softly against a piece of gravel, and the sound seemed deafening in the silence. I lifted it, turning it over in my hands. The sight of it, this immense, silent testament to a large, unidentified, and recently consumed creature, was sickening. It felt ancient and yet freshly used. Just as I turned to walk back to the truck, the bone still heavy in my hand, I heard a sound that froze me where I stood. It was a low, rapid, continuous chittering sound. Not a growl, not a bark, but high-frequency, complex clicking and chattering, like 1,000 insects moving their mandibles at once, or dry pebbles being rattled rapidly together. And it was coming from directly behind the rhododendron bush where I had just found the bone. The sound was accompanied by a subtle, unsettling movement. The thick leaves of the bush, which had been perfectly still, began to shake rapidly, but only at the very bottom, right against the dirt, as if something low to the ground and incredibly frantic was hiding just out of sight. The chittering intensified instantly, sounding closer, more frantic, and now possessed a quality that was clearly communicating warning, threat, and perhaps impatience. It was the sound of a very small, very tight-knit hunting pack, annoyed at an intrusion on their territory, or worse, annoyed at the theft of a valued possession, the remnant of a recent meal. My mind finally snapped back from curiosity to survival. Whatever creature this bone belonged to, whatever creatures were making that frantic, clicking noise, they were right there, just out of my sight, and they had been watching me the entire time, waiting for me to turn my back. The bone in my hand felt less like an archaeological find and more like a stolen piece of bait. I didn't run. I didn't want to break the silence with the sound of my panicked retreat. I simply let the massive, clean bone drop from my hand onto the damp earth. It hit with a heavy, final thud. The chittering immediately dropped in volume, replaced by a momentary, heavy silence. I backed away slowly, carefully, not taking my eyes off the shaking base of the rhododendron bush until my foot hit the edge of the gravel road. Then I bolted. I ran the final 20 feet to the truck, scrambling up the steel steps and slamming the driver's side door shut with a violent clang. I threw the lock down, not even daring to look back into the woods. I cranked the engine. The massive diesel roared to life, a beautiful, deafening counterpoint to the deep silence of the forest. I threw the transmission into drive, ignoring the approaching pickup truck that was now waiting on the far side of the bridge, and stomped the accelerator. The tires spun on the loose gravel, spitting a cloud of rocks behind me as I tore off down the road. I didn't slow down for the one-lane bridge. I simply barreled across, the heavy rig rattling the stone structure. I drove hard until I hit a major state highway, the memory of that enormous clean bone and the sound of the rapid, hateful chittering playing over and over in my mind. The creatures that had made that noise, whatever they were agile, organized, and focused on protecting the remains of something unspeakably large. I never went back for the drop-off. The construction company could find me. I still get chills thinking about that glint of white bone in the shadows of the Ozark scrub, and the immediate, terrifying sound that reminded me that out there, deep in the isolation, I was nothing more than a potential future meal. Story 14. The route took me south, skirting the edge of the Talladega National Forest in Alabama. A run I usually didn't mind, but the humidity was thick and oppressive, making the late August air feel heavy and unmoving. I hit my mandatory break time well after the sun went down, and rather than pull into a noisy, trash-filled truck stop, I took a detour recommended by a local at a gas station. A small, secluded lake used primarily by seasonal residents, meaning it would be quiet this late in the year. I found a decent, level gravel apron near a small, rickety public launch and parked my rig. The place was surrounded by thick pines, and the silence, initially, was restorative. I decided to take advantage of the quiet. I grabbed my old tackle box and a folding chair. I wasn't just resting, I was taking a proper break. I walked down to the edge of the water. There was a small, dilapidated wooden dock jutting out maybe 10 feet, clearly neglected but still stable enough to stand on. The lake itself was the first thing that struck me as odd. The water was unnaturally clear, almost crystalline, yet it held a deep, intense blackness, reflecting the dark sky like polished obsidian. It was still completely unmoving, except for the tiny, almost imperceptible fold of water where it met the mossy bank. I set up my chair and cast my line, a simple nightcrawler on a hook, out into the black glass. I sat there for what must have been an hour, maybe more, listening to the vast, hollow silence. I watched my bobber, waiting for the slightest movement, the tiniest ripple to indicate a fish was even curious. But nothing happened. Not a nibble, not a twitch, not even the small, investigative tug you get from bait fish. The water was completely and utterly dead. It was while I was waiting for the 100th minute to pass that I realized the true extent of the silence. It wasn't just the fish. There were no insects. The air should have been alive with the hum of mosquitoes, the chirp of crickets, the rhythmic call of cicadas. Nothing. There were no frogs croaking in the reeds along the bank. No owls calling from the ancient pines. No distant squabble of raccoons. The entire environment was mute, frozen, as if the air itself was holding its breath. It felt like standing in a vacuum, a pristine, profound silence that felt less like nature at rest and more like a vast, cold control. I slowly lowered my gaze back to the water, shining my small headlamp briefly at the dock pilings, seeking some sign of life, a crawfish or a water spider. I found nothing. Then I saw the movement. It was far beneath the surface, maybe 20 feet out, visible only because the water was so unnaturally clear. It was a massive shape, a shadow against the pale, sandy lake bottom that was far too large to be a discarded log or a large sunken piece of debris. It moved with a slow, serpentine grace, utterly black against the pale sediment below. It was immense. I couldn't make out any distinct features. No fins, no eyes, no head, just a fluid, continuous, horrifying length of shadow, gliding smoothly through the water as if friction didn't exist. The sheer size suggested something easily 20 or 30 feet long, thick as an oil drum, and perfectly adapted to the cold, dark depths. My heart started to pound, a massive, deafening drumbeat that suddenly felt like the only noise in the entire world. I pulled my line out of the water, not caring if the splash startled the thing. I stood rigid on the wooden planks of the dock, watching the slow, elegant movement of the shape as it cruised in a wide arc, seemingly examining the shoreline. And then it came closer. The shadow turned, and with agonizing slowness, it began to glide directly toward the dock. It didn't swim quickly or thrash. It moved with a chilling, geological certainty, a black, undulating mass traversing the silent depths. As the shadow passed directly beneath the small, rickety dock where I stood, I could feel it. The entire section of water surrounding the dock shifted, a deep, heavy displacement of water that was barely perceptible to the eye, but profoundly felt through the wooden planks under my feet. The wood groaned under the silent, passing weight. And with that passage came a sudden, intense cold. It wasn't the temperature of the water. It was a pure, paralyzing cold that seemed to radiate up from the dark fluid, washing over my legs and torso. It felt less like a drop in temperature and more like an electrical current of absolute, silent malevolence. It was a cold that spoke of deep time, of indifference, and of pure, ancient dominion. It was the feeling of being in the presence of something utterly alien, completely unchallenged, and supremely powerful. The shadow glided past, silent and unseen in the surface water, and continued its slow journey away from the dock, back toward the center of the lake. I followed its movement with my eyes until the depth and the blackness swallowed the massive shape completely, leaving only the pristine, glassy surface remaining. I stood there for long minutes, unable to move, listening to the profound, overwhelming silence that had returned. I finally understood the truth of this place. The absolute quiet, the lack of birds, the absence of insects, the dead stillness of the water, the utter lack of fish on my line. It was all explained by the king of that black water. The environment wasn't sleeping, it was suppressed. Everything that could swim, fly, or crawl near that lake knew the price of making noise, the cost of drawing attention. It was the reason nothing swam here, because this one massive, unseen entity had claimed the entire ecosystem as its silent, frozen territory. I reeled in my line, my hands shaking so violently I could barely wind the spool. I packed up my chair and tackle box with mechanical, careful silence, making sure not to scrape the metal box on the gravel. I didn't rush, but every movement felt like a risk, knowing that the black water held a massive shadow that was now fully aware of my presence. I climbed back into my truck, locked the doors, and started the engine, allowing the roar of the diesel to finally shatter the horrible silence. I didn't look back at the dock, only at the road ahead, driving away from that secluded lake house and the terrifying knowledge I'd gained. The only thing living in that deep, clear water was something ancient and horrifyingly patient, and it had shown me the terrifying reason why the mountains sometimes fall completely silent. I drove until the rising sun bleached the terrifying memory from the road, but the cold, intense feeling of that silent passage beneath the dock remains with me, a chilling reminder of the things that rule the hidden water of the Appalachians. Story 15. The route we were running was a long, punishing two-man team haul through the middle of the Tennessee mountains, dropping agricultural equipment from Kentucky down to a distribution hub outside Knoxville. My partner, Ben, had taken the late afternoon shift, and by 1 a.m., I was back in the driver's seat, running on coffee and fumes. Ben was sound asleep in the sleeper cab behind me, snoring that deep, rattling snore that only comes from a man who has been driving heavy machinery for 12 hours straight. We were due for a mandatory 30-minute break, and I was scanning the roadside for any viable pull-off. I spotted a faint gravel track that promised a little solitude. It was clearly a dead-end road, leading to a small cluster of rundown, likely seasonal lake houses that were completely dark in the heavy night. The kind of place where privacy was absolute and supervision non-existent. I pulled the massive truck into the darkest part of the clearing, set the air brakes, and killed the engine. The resulting silence was thick and immediate, broken only by the loud hiss of the air brakes' bleeding pressure and the settling metal of the cooling engine. I reclined the driver's seat back, rubbing the grit out of my eyes, enjoying the sudden stillness. I was just about to set the alarm on my phone when I heard it. It was a faint, high-pitched voice, very soft, almost a whisper, and undeniably female. It called out one word, "Ben." I froze instantly. I looked back through the narrow gap in the curtains to the sleeper cab. Ben was absolutely out cold, head slumped against the pillow, breathing heavy. He hadn't heard a thing. I listened intently. The voice sounded like it was coming from the woods directly behind the truck, where the gravel turned to thick undergrowth and pines. I figured it was a lost hiker, maybe a local who had wandered off from one of the houses down the road. It was unsettlingly late for someone to be wandering alone, but not impossible. I waited for the voice to call again. After maybe 15 seconds, it did. This time, it was slightly louder, clearer, and possessed a strange, thin resonance, like a bell being struck underwater. "Ben, I'm waiting for you." My blood ran cold, instantly cutting through the exhaustion. It had used his name. Not hello, not is anyone there but Ben. The voice knew who was in the truck, or at least knew the name of one of the occupants. Ben hadn't mentioned knowing anyone in this area, let alone someone who would be waiting for him at 1:30 a.m. on a desolate service road. And the tone, it wasn't panicked or lost. It was possessive, almost coaxing. I gripped the steering wheel, my mind racing. I didn't dare turn on the interior light or the headlights. I just sat, utterly still, listening to the silence that followed the call. The silence felt loaded now, a tense pause in a conversation I desperately wanted no part of. Then the creature moved. I could hear the faint, dry shush of disturbed pine needles and dried leaves, a sound that quickly moved from the back of the trailer to the driver's side of the cab. It was moving fast, silently, and directly toward me. The voice was now right outside the driver's side window, inches from my head. It spoke again, louder still, but retaining that unsettling, wet-sounding timbre, as if the speaker had a mouth full of water or thick fluid. "Ben, please come out. We need to talk." The use of the full name, Ben, who was sound asleep, and the demanding, yet soft, urgency of the request was pure horror. This was an intelligent trap. It knew his identity, and it was trying to lure him out, using a tone of intimate, compelling need. The air felt heavy with menace, and I could feel the thin glass of the window separating me from whatever grotesque thing was waiting outside. I knew I had to move, and I had to break the pattern. The creature was focused entirely on its slow, verbal siege. If Ben remained asleep, the thing might eventually try to gain access. If he woke up and reacted, the game would change. I reached back with my right hand and violently shook Ben's shoulder. Ben, wake up. Now," I hissed, keeping my own voice low but urgent. Ben bolted upright in the sleeper cab, hitting his head on the ceiling, rubbing his eyes, and muttering a confused string of curses. "Wah, what the hell, man? We still driving?" The instant Ben moved, the instant his physical presence was confirmed by his abrupt shift in posture and his human voice, the voice outside the cab let out a piercing, unholy shriek. It wasn't the shriek of a woman in pain. It was a noise of pure, agonizing frustration and rage, high and thin, utterly alien, and so sharp it made my ears ring. The sound seemed to tear the very air around the cab. The shriek was immediately followed by a massive, violent crashing sound as whatever was outside tore through the underbrush. I heard the snapping of thick branches and the heavy, dull thud of weight hitting the soft earth as the creature bolted away from the truck. It was fleeing in a panic, moving with brutal speed toward the direction of the lake. I didn't wait. I threw the transmission into neutral, slammed the key, and roared the engine to life. Before Ben could even fully ask what was going on, I had thrown the rig into drive and was peeling out of the lot, tires spitting gravel. What was that noise? It sounded like a fox got run over. Ben shouted, finally lucid. "No, Ben, it wasn't a fox. Did you hear anything else just now?" I kept my eyes focused on the narrow road, pushing the truck hard. Ben was silent for a moment, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, just as you woke me up. I thought I heard something call my name. Real soft, like a woman's voice, but wet. I thought I was dreaming." My heart sank into my gut. He had heard it. The shriek hadn't been the only thing he caught. Whatever was out there had spoken his name with an intimacy that felt earned, recognized, and terrifying. We drove for a solid hour before either of us said another word, pushing the truck far out of the mountain roads and back toward the safety of the interstate. We tried to talk about it later, rationalizing it as a trick of the exhausted mind, but neither of us could shake the facts. A vocalizer that knew his full name, that sounded intensely human, but ended in an inhuman shriek of frustration, and that was powerful enough to tear through the thick woods in seconds. We never figured out how it knew his name. Maybe it wasn't his name at all, but a mimicry of sound it had heard before, a lure learned over years of observation in the dark. But the intent was clear. The creature was intelligent. It was hunting, and it was trying to coax its prey out of the vehicle and into the darkness. I still run team hauls, but every time I wake up in the sleeper cab, I listen for that silence, and I pray I never hear that soft, wet whisper again. The woods are dark, but the things that know your name are infinitely darker. Story 16. The delivery was to an architecturally eccentric, highly secluded lake house perched somewhere on the steep, wooded shores of Table Rock Lake in the Missouri Ozarks. The address was so vague it required a set of handwritten directions from the client, leading me miles off the state highway down a crumbling, rutted service road that seemed to get narrower and darker with every mile. The job was late, well past sunset, and I was just supposed to drop the load of custom windows and leave the signed paperwork in the mailbox. When I finally crested a small rise and the property came into view, the structure was massive, darkly shadowed, and utterly silent. It was one of those bizarre, angular wooden houses built into the side of a hill, all sharp corners and massive glass panes facing the lake. I parked the rig as close as the driveway allowed, set the air brakes, and grabbed the bill of lading and my heavy-duty flashlight. The air was cold and damp, holding the deep, heavy silence of the isolated forest. I walked the short distance from the truck to the front porch, the gravel crunching loudly under my boots, feeling intensely exposed in the powerful cone of my flashlight beam. I was focused on finding the mailbox when something on the side of the house, facing the dense woods, snagged my attention. It was a door, not the main entry door, but a simple, plain wooden door set directly into the exterior wall of the house. And it was positioned bizarrely, easily 6 feet off the ground. There was no balcony, no staircase, no ladder, not even a sill extending from the frame, just the door hovering above the uneven, moss-covered dirt. It looked like the house had simply forgotten to provide a connection between the door and the ground. I stopped dead, turning my flashlight beam squarely on the object. The wood of the door was old, weathered, and warped, darker than the rest of the house siding, as if it had been there for decades. It was sealed tight into its frame, but it looked functional. It was utterly out of place, a physical absurdity in the architecture of the house, serving no discernible purpose. Why would anyone install a sealed door 6 feet above the ground? Compulsion, that old, dark compulsion that always leads you to the worst discovery, pulled me closer. I walked around the corner of the house, the gravel crunching under my feet, until I stood directly beneath the hovering door. As I got closer, I saw a detail I'd missed in the distance. The door was not entirely plain. It had a small, square window, no bigger than a paperback book, set just below eye level if you were standing on a hypothetical floor inside. The glass was filthy, covered in grime and spider webs, and over the glass, securing the window, was a heavy, rusted iron latch. It was the kind of latch you see on ancient cellars or deep bunkers. Thick, curved metal design for absolute security. I tilted my head back, staring up at the door, trying to see beyond the grimy glass. The interior was absolute, light-swallowing blackness, devoid of any reflection or hint of illumination. The silence was intense, but now it felt less empty and more watchful. And then I saw it move. Slowly, deliberately, with a terrible, grinding sound that barely cut through the silence. The heavy, rusted latch on the small window began to lift up. It moved from its horizontal lock position to a vertical release, and the whole movement was smooth, controlled, and undeniable. It was not wind. It was not rust giving way. Something was releasing the lock from the inside. I froze, locked in a state of absolute paralysis, my beam fixed on the window. The cold dread that hit me was physical, seizing my lungs and tightening my throat. I watched the latch fall fully vertical. And then the door itself moved. With a soft, sickening creak, the bottom corner of the heavy wooden door eased inward, creating a thin, vertical slice of blackness in the side of the house. The gap was maybe an inch wide, but that single inch was enough to reveal the interior of the void beyond. It was a blackness so profound it seemed to actively consume the light from my powerful flashlight, not reflecting a single photon. It looked less like a room and more like a tear in reality, a space where no light had ever been allowed to exist. And from that gap, I heard a sound, a low, slow, raspy hiss. It was the sound of dry leaves scraping together under pressure, or perhaps rough, desiccated skin being dragged across a cold, rough surface. It was a sound of ancient, difficult breathing coming from deep within that light-swallowing void. The air around me felt suddenly frigid, intensely cold, despite the temperate night. The hiss wasn't a warning. It was a noise of anticipation, the sound of something large and slow testing the boundaries of its confinement. I stood there, weaponized by terror, unable to move a muscle. I was staring into the gap, knowing that whatever was inside was now staring directly out at me, studying the light, studying the easy way down. The hissing continued, slow and wet. Then, the movement reversed. The gap narrowed, the door creaking shut with the same excruciating slowness. It was deliberate, controlled movement, not a slam or a sudden fright. And as the door swung back into its frame, the heavy, rusted latch dropped back into place, securing the opening with a final, echoing clunk. The silence returned, more absolute than before, the only evidence of the terrifying event being the sudden, violent tremor that ran through my entire body. The thing that terrified me the most was the control. It hadn't burst out. It hadn't screamed or attacked. It had simply tested the lock, opened the door just enough to observe me, hissed its terrible, dry breath, and then closed itself back in, as if realizing that the time for its true emergence was not quite yet. I didn't try to deliver the paperwork. I didn't stop to question the pickup truck waiting for me up the road. I ran. I turned and bolted back to my rig, scrambling into the cab and slamming the door shut. I cranked the engine, threw the transmission into gear, and spun the tires hard on the gravel, tearing out of that secluded property. I never looked in a rear-view mirror, driving like a maniac until I hit the relative sanity of the main highway. I have no idea what that door was for, or why it was placed 6 feet above the ground, or what enormous, slow-moving thing lived in the perpetual darkness behind it. But I know it wasn't a maintenance access or a forgotten design flaw. It was an egress point for something that was sealed in, and for one terrifying, silent minute, it had decided to open its aperture and inspect the world outside. The memory of that absolute, light-swallowing blackness and the slow, raspy hiss of the thing waiting inside is the true terror. It wasn't looking for a way out. It was simply looking, and it closed the door when it was finished watching me. Story 17. The job was a long, irritating drive through the Carolinas, and by the time I hit the state line near Lake Wylie, the exhaustion was severe. I desperately needed to park the rig and grab a few hours of sleep before the morning rush. I pulled off onto a barely paved service road that snaked down toward the lake, finding a wide, desolate turnaround that was clearly the site of a failed, abandoned real estate development. There was a single, large, half-built lake house looming over the gravel lot, its raw plywood siding already starting to darken and peel from the elements. No lights, no neighbors, no traffic, just the immense quiet of the deep woods. It was perfect, if a little unsettling. I set the air brakes, cut the engine, and dropped into the deep sleep of the road. I woke up around 5 a.m., just as the sky was turning that pale, cold indigo that precedes the dawn. I realized I needed to stretch my legs and find a secluded spot for a necessary biological break before I started the engine again. I grabbed my powerful LED flashlight and stepped out of the cab into the chilly, damp air. As I walked away from the rig and toward the back of the lot, I passed by the front of the derelict cabin. I swept my beam across the gravel and the porch, and that's when I saw it. It was a strange, impossible sight that instantly jolted me wide awake. Directly on the weathered, bottom step of the cabin's porch, placed almost neatly in the center, was a small, disturbing pile of objects. I stepped closer, the beam illuminating the collection. They were children's dolls and toys. There must have been 10 or 12 items, ranging from hard plastic baby dolls to stuffed plush animals, all nestled together in a small, deliberate heap. They were all covered in a thick, uniform layer of dried mud and grime, as if they had been dragged repeatedly through the same section of wet earth. But the damage wasn't from weather or simple abandonment. It was methodical, violent mutilation. Every single doll was missing at least one limb. Their plastic arms and legs were twisted and broken off at the joints. The plush animals, a bear, a rabbit, a floppy-eared dog, had been ripped open, their cotton stuffing pulled out and hanging in damp, gray clumps around the base of the pile. Most disturbing was the evidence of teeth. The hard plastic of the baby doll heads was heavily, savagely gnawed, covered in deep, parallel indentations that had stripped away the thin paint. The eyes of every single doll, whether plastic or glass, had been meticulously gouged out, leaving only empty, scraped-out sockets that stared blankly into the light beam. This wasn't the random destruction of neglect or the clumsy damage of small children. This was predatory, deliberate damage, the work of something with a focused, visceral need to destroy. It looked like the aftermath of a ritual or a cold, quiet form of play. I stood there, staring at the pile, a wave of cold nausea washing over me. These weren't just discarded toys. They were an offering, or maybe the remnants of a kill. The sight suggested an intelligent creature that understood the form of human playthings, but processed them through a terrifying, violent instinct. I took a slow, deliberate step back off the porch. I had to get away from the immediate presence of that sickening pile. My eyes scanned the clearing, looking for any sign of a squatter's camp, or maybe a feral person who had left their collection. But the lot was still empty, and the silence was total. Just as I turned my back on the porch and took 2 more cautious steps toward the truck, I heard it. A twig snapped, loudly, sharply. It came from the woods directly behind the derelict cabin, maybe 40 or 50 feet away, right at the dense tree line. It wasn't the muffled sound of a falling branch. It was the crisp, undeniable sound of a heavy foot setting down too quickly on a dry stick. I froze, heart slamming against my ribs. I slowly, carefully swung the beam of my flashlight toward the sound. The light cut into the black wall of the pines. I didn't see a clear shape, but for a fleeting moment, a microsecond before the creature realized the light was upon it, I saw a flash of white and black against the dark trees. It was a momentary shift of contrast, a wide, pale white shape against the dark trunk, flanked by something black and matted. It was too fast, too low, and too far away to resolve into a deer, a bear, or a person. It was just a large, low shadow that was instantly gone, absorbed back into the impenetrable curtain of the Ozark scrub, leaving only the oppressive silence behind. The shock of the movement was enough. That flash of shape, combined with the unnerving evidence of the gnawed, mud-caked dolls on the porch step, was all the proof I needed. Whatever was out there had been watching me, or rather, watching its collection, and I had disturbed its quiet morning routine. It had just finished its game, and it was lurking close by, annoyed by my intrusion. I didn't wait to see if the creature would return to its collection, or if it would decide to investigate the new, large source of heat and noise. I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off the tree line where the white and black shadow had vanished. I felt the overwhelming, primal urge to bolt, but I forced myself to walk with agonizing slowness, putting one careful boot in front of the other until I reached the safety of the truck steps. I climbed into the cab, slammed the heavy door, and locked it. I cranked the engine and threw the transmission into gear, spinning the tires in a cloud of gravel dust as I tore out of that development lot. I didn't stop, didn't check the air, and didn't look in the rearview mirror until I was 10 miles away and back on the safety of the highway. The image of that pile of meticulously destroyed toys, the gnawed plastic, the gouged out eyes, haunts me to this day. It wasn't simple savagery. It suggested a twisted, patient intellect playing a game I couldn't comprehend. Whatever lurks in the deep woods near Lake Wiley knows what human children play with, and it collects their broken remnants, leaving them as a silent, terrifying warning. And I know I was within feet of it when I saw that flash of white and black. I had just walked away from its collection, and its game had only just begun. Story 18. The end of the run took me deep into the heart of West Virginia, hauling specialized mining equipment to a facility tucked away near the Monongahela National Forest. I was well off the interstate, navigating a series of winding, unforgiving mountain roads, and when I finally hit my mandatory break time, I was completely isolated. I found an old, moss-covered pull-off near a small, unnamed, secluded lake. The place was beautiful in a stark, unsettling way. There was a single derelict lake house visible through the trees, its windows dark and boarded up, but the lot provided a perfect, level spot to park the rig. I killed the engine, and the silence that rushed in was absolute, a thick, heavy blanket of mountain quiet. The air was cold, intensely clean, and smelled heavily of damp pine and cold water. I leaned back in the driver's seat, letting the exhaustion wash over me. The truck was parked maybe 10 feet from the water's edge, and I could just see the lake through the driver's side window. The surface was impossibly still, undisturbed by wind or ripple, turning the dark water into a perfect, flawless mirror. I was getting ready to settle into the bunk, but first, I needed to check the load one last time. I was looking out the driver's window, reaching up to adjust the large, rectangular side mirror to ensure I had a good view of the trailer's rear axle, when I caught a clear view of the lake surface. The still water was reflecting the cab of the truck with surgical clarity. I could see the dashboard, the curve of the roof, the seat, and my own silhouette sitting there exactly as I was, hands on the wheel, head facing forward. The reflection was precise, perfect, and utterly still, a flawless photographic negative of my reality. As I was focusing on the detail of the reflection, the white stripe of my shirt, the dark curve of my head, I saw it. It happened slowly, deliberately, and with a horrifying certainty that defied physics and reason. My reflection in the water, the mirrored image of myself sitting in the truck, slowly, smoothly turned its head. My actual head remained facing forward, my eyes fixed on the side mirror I was adjusting. But the reflection in the lake's surface turned its head to the left, pivoting with a quiet, sickening motion that was utterly disconnected from my own body. The reflected eyes, my eyes, were looking directly backward, staring over my shoulder past the sleeper cab and toward the dark woods and the abandoned lake house beyond. It was only a split second, maybe less than half a second, but I saw the reflection's expression with agonizing clarity. It wasn't the calm, tired look of my actual face. The reflection was twisted into a mask of pure, paralyzing terror. The eyes were wide and fixed. The mouth was an open, silent O of agony, staring with absolute, visceral horror at something that was directly behind me, something that I could not see. The shock was a lightning bolt of adrenaline that ripped through my body. I whipped my actual head around, violently twisting in the seat, throwing my hand out and gripping the back of the sleeper cab's curtain, expecting to see a monster, a face, a shape, anything that would justify that impossible, terrified gaze. But there was nothing, just the dark, impenetrable curtain of the pines, the outline of the abandoned cabin, and the overwhelming, heavy silence of the night. No movement, no noise, no sign of life or threat. I quickly turned back to the lake, my heart pounding so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. The water was perfectly still again. The reflection was there, sitting normally, facing forward, the expression calm, tired, and exactly mirroring my current state of wide-eyed panic. The terrifying, fearful look was gone. The movement had never happened. The surface of the water was flawless. I felt a paralyzing sense of dread, a chilling conviction that the lake's surface had shown me a moment, a fraction of a second into the future, a terrifying warning of something that was coming for me, something that was already standing directly behind my oblivious, still body. The lake, acting as an unnatural, momentary portal, had given me a glimpse of the inevitable terror waiting just out of sight. The utter isolation of the place, the unnatural stillness of the water, and the knowledge that I had been shown my own future fear was a profound, cold violation. I was in a place where the veil between the known and the unknown was paper thin, and that deep, mirror-like water was acting as a window for something terrible. I didn't stop to grab my knife, my flashlight, or even my coat. I didn't reach for the handgun in the lockbox. I didn't dare turn my head again. I threw the keys into the ignition, my hands shaking so violently I nearly missed the slot. The diesel engine roared to life, shattering the mountain silence with a beautiful, desperate violence. I threw the transmission into gear and floored the accelerator, not caring that I was spinning the tires on the wet gravel. I tore the heavy rig out of that clearing, driving blindly back up the rutted access road. Every nerve in my body was screaming at me to look in the side mirror, to check the back window, to confirm the threat was gone, but I couldn't. I was terrified that if I looked at the side mirror, the perfectly reflective glass would also show me that horrible, terrified expression looking over my shoulder, confirming that the monster had finally caught up. I drove until the dark, oppressive mass of the Monongahela was far behind me, until the road widened and the lights of a distant town finally broke the dark horizon. Only then, hundreds of miles away, did I finally dare to stop the engine and let the trembling subside. I never forgot that image, that second of horrifying clarity, the look of pure, agonizing fear on my own reflected face, staring at something I couldn't see. I know that lake is a dead place, a window into a horrifying reality. The terror wasn't the creature itself. The terror was the realization that I had been given a preview of my own death, shown to me by an ancient, silent mirror, warning me of the thing that silently watches from the dark woods of West Virginia, waiting for the perfect moment to step into view. Story 19. The final leg of the delivery took me into the quiet, dark recesses of Lake Norris in Tennessee. I was hauling specialized maintenance equipment to a small, privately owned marina, the kind of place that closes shop immediately after sunset. The receiving office was a renovated old lake house, perched right near the water, isolated from any town by miles of winding, two-lane road. I arrived well after midnight, the black sky heavy with clouds and the air thick with dampness. I pulled the rig right up alongside the main office building, placing my sleeper cab directly parallel to the structure, planning to wait until the first light for the drop. I shut down the engine, and the silence was deep, but not peaceful. It was the heavy, close silence of a remote place, where the sounds of nature have been either amplified or completely suppressed. I checked my locks, pulled the curtains, and tried to settle in, but the exhaustion was fighting with the unsettling nature of the isolated environment. I finally managed to drift off, but it couldn't have been more than an hour later when I was woken up by a faint, persistent noise. It was a scratching sound, soft and rhythmic, coming from the roof directly above the sleeper cab. My first thought was a raccoon or a large possum. They often scramble onto trucks, drawn by the residual warmth or the possibility of dropped food. But the sound was too light, too delicate, and too consistent to be a clumsy animal. It was a fine, scraping sound. SHHK, like dry fingernails being drawn across a rough surface, or perhaps thin metal being gently abraded. I sat up quietly in the bunk, listening hard. The sound was definitely coming from the roof of the adjacent building, right above the level where my cab sat. It wasn't moving. It was stationary, focused on a single spot. I reached for my heavy-duty, tactical flashlight. I knew shining a light on a startled animal would likely make it bolt, but the sheer persistence and unnerving quality of the noise made me feel like I needed to know what I was sharing the lot with. I slowly pulled back the thin blackout curtain on the driver's side and pointed the flashlight toward the structure. I flicked the beam on. The powerful light cut a harsh, focus cone onto the side of the old lake house, sweeping up the cedar siding. The beam landed squarely on the eaves, right near the peak of the roof, where a small, square attic ventilation grate was installed. And that's where I saw it. My stomach seized, and the blood instantly drained from my face, leaving me cold and lightheaded. The object was not a raccoon, and it was not a normal bird. Two narrow, impossibly pale fingers were curled around the metal mesh of the vent grate. The fingers were long and slender, seemingly devoid of knuckles, and were pressed firmly against the wire mesh, gripping it with unnerving strength. The skin was a sickly, translucent white, almost luminous in the powerful beam of the light, and looked wet or greasy. The fingers belonged to something inside the attic, and I could see a sliver of it, pressed right up against the mesh behind the wire, was a portion of its face. It was impossibly thin, stretched, and obscured by the wire, but I could make out the edge of a massive, black, unblinking eye. It reflected the beam of my flashlight with the flat, glossy indifference of an insect's eye, dark, utterly vacant, and terrifyingly large. Whatever it was inside the attic, and it was watching me. The noise I had heard, the scratching, was now explained. It was the sound of those thin, rigid fingers scraping on the metal mesh as the creature adjusted its grip. As I stared, paralyzed by the sight, the pale fingers slowly, deliberately tightened their grip on the grate. The movement was slow, intentional, and sickeningly powerful. I could see the subtle give of the old mesh as the impossible fingers applied pressure. The air felt like it had thickened into a solid mass. I killed the light instantly, plunging the cab back into absolute, light-swallowing darkness. I slammed the curtain shut, the small noise echoing loudly in the cab. My heart was hammering so hard it felt like it would tear through my chest. I scrambled back into the sleeper bunk, pulling my thick blanket around me, not for warmth, but for the pitiful, illusory comfort of concealment. I pressed my back against the wall of the cab, facing the structure. The silence that followed the loss of light was absolute for only a second. Then, I heard the sound again, louder this time, less scraping and more prying. Scrare ape, pop. Scrare ape, pop. It was the terrifying, persistent sound of metal being bent and stressed. It was no longer scratching. It was actively trying to get the grate off. The pauses between the sound were deliberate. The sound itself indicating immense, focused effort. It wasn't an animal reacting to being seen. It was an intelligent being who had been observed while watching, and who was now working with renewed, silent urgency to remove the barrier between itself and me. I could hear the faint, high-pitched ping of the old wire mesh protesting the impossible pressure of those pale, clawed fingers. I stayed awake all night, rigid with terror, my eyes fixed on the ceiling of the cab, listening to that terrifying, persistent scrape. The sound moved slightly, suggesting the creature was shifting its weight, using its leverage. It would scrape, pause, apply pressure, and then scrape again, moving its impossibly strong fingers around the perimeter of the vent. I was convinced that if it managed to get the grate off, if that massive, black, I finally had a clear view of the night, the creature would drop directly onto the roof of my sleeper cab, separated from me by only a few inches of fiberglass and metal. The thought of that wet, pale body and its strange, clawed fingers on the roof above my head was enough to keep me absolutely paralyzed in the darkness. The scraping continued, relentless and methodical, right up until the sky began to turn a sickly, pale gray just before dawn. As the light strengthened, the scraping suddenly stopped, not with a bang or a rush, but with the same unnatural control with which it began. The creature simply ceased its work, retreating silently back into the dark recesses of the attic. I waited for another hour, not moving a muscle, until the sun had fully risen, casting sharp shadows on the abandoned marina. I started the engine, threw the cab door open, and fled the sleeper bunk. I didn't dare shine the flashlight up again. I didn't look at the grate. I just wanted to get away from the structure and the attic that held that quiet, powerful horror. I made the delivery as quickly as possible, dropping the equipment and signing the manifest with shaking hands. I drove out of Lake Norris and never looked back. I know that creature is still in the attic of that old lake house, waiting in the perpetual dark, its pale fingers ready to resume their slow, focused work. I saw its horrifying, silent face, and I know that the faint, scraping sound I heard was the sound of a patient, intelligent thing trying to make its way out into the night to finish the job it started. And the most chilling part is knowing it was watching me sleep the entire time. Story 20. The fog was the problem. It had rolled in thick and white through the deep valley in rural Virginia, hugging the winding ribbon of asphalt that ran near the New River. It was a suffocating, blinding presence, and after an hour of creeping along, straining to see the white divider line, I decided I couldn't push the heavy rig any further. I needed to pull over and wait for the sun to burn it off. I spotted a faint, overgrown track leading toward what looked like a flooded depression, a small, unnamed pond that had been expanded into a tiny, isolated lake, and decided to risk it. The track ended abruptly in a small, gravel clearing beside a dilapidated hunting cabin. The structure was clearly abandoned, windows boarded over with mismatched plywood, the roof sagging under the weight of years of neglect. I set the air brakes, killed the massive diesel engine, and instantly, the absolute silence of the fog-bound woods wrapped around the truck. As the noise of the machinery died, another sensation rushed in, immediate and overwhelming. A smell. It was powerful, distinct, and utterly strange. It was like burnt brown sugar, mixed with the acrid scent of wet ash, and something else, something sickeningly, intensely sweet like rotting fruit or concentrated molasses, but with a sharp chemical tang underneath. It was cloying and offensive, clinging to the heavy, damp air. I couldn't stay inside with it. The smell was so strong it was starting to make my stomach clench. I grabbed my flashlight, pulled on my heavy leather jacket, and stepped out of the cab. The smell was stronger outside, thick and heavy, and I knew I couldn't rest until I'd figured out the source. My first thought was a dump site, or perhaps a clandestine cooking operation, but the smell didn't quite match either. I walked slowly around the front of the truck, the ground soft and damp under my boots. The odor was strongest near the back of the cabin. I followed the scent, moving cautiously along the warped, moss-covered siding. The cabin's back door was hanging slightly ajar, exposing a slice of pitch-black interior, but the smell seemed to be emanating from past the cabin, toward the water. I rounded the final corner and found myself standing on a small, overgrown bank that dropped down to the lake. The lake itself was a dead, flat mirror under the heavy fog, reflecting the white obscurity perfectly. Just below me, right at the water's edge, was an old wooden dock. It was warped and rotten, its planks slimy with decades of moisture. But the surface was where the true horror lay. Scattered across the old wooden planks were strange, sticky, dark brown stains. They weren't a uniform spill. They were scattered smears and pools, running together in random, viscous patterns. They looked like something had been repeatedly slopped or dumped onto the wood, and then partially dried and partially washed away by rain. They weren't blood, they lacked the metallic tang, but they looked horribly organic, viscous and thick. The stench, the burnt sugar and wet ash, was emanating directly from these stains. I walked carefully down onto the dock, my flashlight beam illuminating the scene. The planks were covered in the stuff. It looked like someone had been melting something sweet and heavy, maybe a strange resin or thick, sugar-based compound, and allowing it to cool and dry onto the wood. But why? And why the smell of ash? I knelt beside one of the stains, bringing the light closer. The surface was sticky and slightly fibrous, pulling taut against the wood. As I examined the stain, I noticed something else, a faint, continuous trail of the sticky, dark brown substance. It didn't just end on the dock. It led from the very edge of the water, up the slippery bank, over the tangled roots, and straight into the dark, dense woods behind the cabin. It wasn't a neat line. It was a rough, dragging smear like something heavy and what had been pulled from the water and hauled away into the tree line. A shiver of pure dread ran down my spine, instantly neutralizing the residual warmth of my jacket. I stood up quickly, turning my focus from the horrifying evidence on the dock to the impenetrable dark of the woods. My rational mind screamed, poachers, smugglers, moonshiners, but my gut seized on the truth. This was evidence of a ritual, a strange, sickening activity that had nothing to do with any known human criminal enterprise. The sickly sweet, burnt smell was the scent of a terrible offering. I swung the powerful beam of my flashlight across the entrance to the woods, following the smear trail. My beam was strong, but the fog was fighting it, swallowing the light 30 feet in. I strained, holding my breath, listening only to the relentless, pounding rhythm of my own heart. And then, just at the edge of the fog line, where the light faded into gray obscurity, I saw it. A faint shadow. It was tall, slender, and unnaturally still against the background of the dark trees. It was only there for a split second, a vertical mass that was too still to be a tree and too focused to be a trick of the fog. It moved with a silent, terrifying swiftness, darting sideways into the deeper woods. The shadow wasn't a hallucination. It was a figure, and it was gone before I could force my focus to resolve any detail, leaving only the memory of its height and its unnatural speed. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't a clumsy bear. It was a tall, slender form, something that had been watching me from the moment I started to investigate the disgusting, sweet-smelling evidence on the dock. It was the thing that had been burning something and leaving those sticky, unsettling stains. I didn't need to confirm its nature. The combination of the stench, the impossible stains, and that fleeting, tall shadow was enough to trigger a pure, primal flight response. I dropped the flashlight, not even thinking about retrieving it, and bolted back toward the truck, scrambling up the wet bank. I threw myself into the cab, slammed the door shut, and locked it. I threw the keys into the ignition, the diesel engine coughing to life with a welcome, deafening roar. I didn't care about the fog. I didn't care about the lack of visibility. I needed to move. I cranked the wheel, threw the transmission into gear, and drove that rig out of the clearing, reversing and plowing through low brush until I hit the narrow track. I didn't stop, pushing the truck as fast as I dared on the fog-shrouded road, focusing only on the gauge of the engine, the feel of the wheel, and the cold reality of the miles stacking up. I drove until the awful, cloying smell of burnt sugar, wet ash, and that sickening sweetness was completely gone from the interior of the cab. I know now, with chilling certainty, that whatever had been on that dock was massive. It was engaged in some strange, horrific ritual, and it had left behind terrifying evidence of its presence. That sickeningly sweet smell was the scent of its ceremony, and it had been watching me disturb its handiwork. The fog in that valley holds more than just moisture. It hides something ancient and foul, and I will never forget the smell of its work. Let's move to the next story. The exhaustion was a cold, constant companion, and the early morning fog near the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains in North Carolina made every mile a terrifying gamble. I desperately needed to park the rig and shut down for a few hours. I spotted a narrow, forgotten access road that led to what looked like an old, isolated private property. I took the risk, pulled off the highway, and slowly negotiated the heavy machinery down the rutted track until I reached a small, desolate clearing. It was an abandoned lake house, massive, darkly shadowed, and completely boarded up, its facade bleached gray by time and neglect. It sat right at the edge of a deep, silent pond that reflected the dense, surrounding pines. The lot was flat, well off the highway, and absolutely silent. I killed the engine, set the air brakes, and leaned back, letting the heavy, damp silence of the woods settle over me. I was reaching for the curtains when an unusual feature of the house caught my eye, even in the dim, pre-dawn light. Bolted to the thick, squat pillars of the front porch were heavy, rusted metal chains. I climbed out of the cab, compelled by a strange mixture of curiosity and dread. The air was frigid, thick with fog and the scent of moss. As I walked toward the front of the cabin, the chains became clearer. They were immense, industrial-grade lengths of iron, the links thick as my fist, the kind of chain you'd see securing a massive ship to a pier or an anchor to the seabed. They looked ancient, caked in rust and lichen, clearly bolted to the solid stone foundation of the porch pillars. I examined the first pillar. The chain was secured high up with massive iron rings and lag bolts, dropping down to the ground. It lay there in a heavy, slack coil on the damp dirt, ending abruptly. It wasn't connected to anything at the bottom. It simply rested on the earth, serving no apparent purpose, a grotesque decoration. It was the same with the next two pillars, heavy chains secured above, ending in inert coils below. It was the fourth pillar, the one closest to the edge of the woods, that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The chain bolted to this pillar was not lying slack. It was pulled taut, It stretched away from the foundation in a straight, uncompromising line, pulled across the mossy lawn, and disappeared into the dense, black tangle of the woods, maybe 50 feet away. The links were straining against the enormous weight pulling on them, pulled so tight that the chain hummed faintly in the silence. It wasn't broken or cut. It looked as if whatever the chain was tethered to had simply walked away, pulling the iron cable taut and straight until it disappeared into the gloom. My heart began to pound a terrible, frantic rhythm against my ribs. The sheer scale of the chain suggested a required restraint far beyond any normal animal or even any normal machinery. I carefully walked the perimeter of the lawn, keeping my eyes fixed on the point where the chain vanished. The terror was profound because the meaning was unmistakable. The chains were not meant to keep people out of the abandoned cabin. They were meant to keep something in the woods restrained. I followed the taut chain until I stood right at the tree lean, where the thick foliage swallowed the iron links. I reached down, my hand shaking, and grabbed a link. It was cold, damp, and immensely heavy. I pulled. The chain groaned in response, a thick, metallic, rasping sound that echoed strangely through the silent trees. I pulled harder, putting my entire body weight into it. The chain remained stubbornly fixed. I could feel a slight give, the smallest movement, but it was anchored to something unmovable and massively heavy deep in the forest, something that barely registered my desperate, puny effort. The metallic groaning continued, a horrible sound of metal fighting immense tension. I let go abruptly, stepping back a pace. The chain settled immediately back into its tight, silent tension, vibrating faintly with the strain. I stared into the dark woods, the deep silence feeling less like quiet and more like a heavy, poised waiting. The logical part of my mind screamed for an explanation. Maybe it was a piece of submerged logging equipment or a heavy foundation anchor for a forgotten satellite tower. But the primal terror, the cold, internal certainty, told me the truth. The weight I felt on the end of that chain was organic, alive, and breathing. The tension was constant, suggesting whatever was attached was simply standing there, immensely heavy and patient, maybe just at the limit of the chain's length. I had just pulled on the leash of a monster. I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off the black point where the chain vanished. The fog, which had initially felt like a problem, now felt like a veil, hiding the immense chained terror in the trees. The chains on the other pillars, the slack, inert coils, had clearly failed at some point, or perhaps they were merely backups. But this one was active. I didn't dare turn my back on the woods until I was safely back in the cab. I climbed in, locked the doors, and threw the blanket over the windows, cutting off the view of that horrifying, taut line disappearing into the trees. I didn't start the engine. The sound might disturb it, might make it restless, might make it decide that the length of the chain was no longer adequate. I sat in the dark cab for what felt like an eternity, listening to the heavy, silent weight in the woods. Every creak of the truck, every settling sound felt like an immense risk. I listened intently for any sound of movement, any scrape of iron on stone, any sign that the terrible, silent struggle was continuing. But there was nothing, just the absolute, heavy silence and the knowledge that 20 yards away, an object of immense, living weight was at the end of a chain meant for a battleship, and that it had chosen this remote, abandoned place as its territory. I waited until the first faint, pale gray of dawn began to bleed through the fog. Only when the light was undeniable did I dare start the engine. I did not turn on the headlights, I did not sound the horn, and I certainly did not unpark the rig from that spot. I simply threw the transmission into gear, turned the wheel, and drove the heavy truck straight across the lawn, making a wide, terrifying arc around the entire area where the chain disappeared. I kept my foot steady on the accelerator, pushing the truck hard and fast, avoiding the need to reverse or slow down. I left that clearing with tire tracks deep in the mud, never once glancing at the porch, the slack chains, or the final, taut line leading into the unforgiving dark. The sheer, silent weight of whatever was anchored there remains with me. The chains were not an accident of architecture. They were a necessary restraint against something immense and terrifying, and the fact that it was still tethered, still contained, but still alive and standing just out of sight is the only closure I ever got. I drove out of those hills, haunted by the knowledge that in the Appalachian darkness, there are prisons built not to contain the guilty, but to barely restrain the monstrous. Let's move to the next story. The delivery was late, far later than it should have been, leaving me deep in the dense, forgotten woods of eastern Kentucky well past midnight. I was hauling specialized radio equipment for a remote, private communication station. The facility was so secluded that the final access road was barely paved, winding through valleys where the moonlight never quite reached the ground. I finally found the designated parking area, a small, gravel clearing just a few hundred yards from the communication tower itself, and pulled the heavy rig off the road. I killed the powerful engine, and the resulting silence was not peaceful. It was immediate, heavy, and cold, the kind of absolute quiet you only find in the highest, most isolated reaches of the Appalachian Mountains. I set the air brakes, pulled the curtains, and settled into the bunk, trying to coax my strained nerves into sleep. I figured the isolation was total. No houses, no traffic, nothing but the whispering pines and the metal silhouette of the tower barely visible against the starless sky. I had been asleep for maybe an hour, drifting in that shallow state of rest common to truck drivers, when a sound snagged me back to consciousness. It was faint, high-pitched, and oddly inconsistent. It was singing. It was coming from the woods off the driver's side, maybe 50 yards away, and it sounded like a child's voice, thin, reedy, and slightly off-key. The tune wasn't a recognizable nursery rhyme or song. It was a simple, repetitive melody, 3 or 4 notes repeated endlessly, almost like a music box that had wound down and was struggling to finish its cycle. My first thought was a lost child, maybe someone who had wandered away from an extremely remote cabin. I sat up quickly, adrenaline spiking. I reached for my flashlight and fumbled with the cab door lock, ready to step out. But then I hesitated. The cold air, the absolute darkness, and the profound isolation of the place made me stop. A lost child would be crying, calling for help, or stumbling through the brush. This was just quiet, endless, reedy singing. I lowered the lock back down and slid over to the driver's seat. I waited, listening intently. The singing continued, thin and persistent. La-la-lee-loo, la-la-lee-loo. It was too steady, too monotonous to be natural. It felt less like a human emotion and more like an automated sequence. Then the sound moved. The singing didn't stop, but the source began to move slowly, stealthily, through the thick undergrowth. It was circling the clearing. The sound moved from the driver's side to the front of the rig, and then along the passenger's side, its thin, unnatural melody unwavering. I could hear the faint, dry crunch of leaves underfoot, but the sound was suppressed, light, suggesting the singer was small or moving with impossible care. I stayed absolutely motionless, peering through the slight crack in the blackout curtains. The movement was too deliberate, too focused to be an accident. It was pacing the circumference of the truck, and the unwavering song was the sonic equivalent of a slow, careful examination. The movement stopped directly behind the trailer, the melody continuing, now muffled by the heavy steel box of the freight. I held my breath, listening. The singing stopped. Abruptly, the subsequent silence was immediately replaced by a new sound, one that sent a cold spike of panic through me. A quiet, soft thump against the rear bumper of the trailer, followed by a faint, metallic scrape. Whatever it was close, and it was climbing the outside of the truck. I slid out of the seat and crept into the sleeper cab, reaching for my heavy-duty work knife. I knew this was not a child. A child wouldn't climb a 40-foot freight trailer in the dark with such focused, silent intent. The sounds became clearer as the creature ascended. A small, rhythmic scritch of something dry and small dragging across the rough aluminum siding. It was moving slowly, directly up the back of the trailer toward the roof of the sleeper cab, where I lay waiting. I gripped the knife, heart hammering against the mattress, listening to the impossible ascent. When the sound finally reached the top edge of the trailer, a few feet from my head, the singing started again. It was louder now, closer, and the strange, reedy timbre was sharper. La-la-lee-loo, la-la-lee-loo. But now I could hear a secondary sound underlying the melody, a soft, wet clicking noise like a tongue working against teeth or a small, bony jaw rapidly articulating. The combination was utterly sickening. The innocent child's song paired with that faint, predatory click-click-click right outside the thin sheet metal of the roof. The rhythmic singing continued, and I could feel a faint, light pressure against the roof of the cab, just inches above my face. It was walking slowly across the top, pacing over the sleeper. The creature was small, but its presence was immense. It was circling my resting place, announcing its arrival, singing its terrible little song. I was trapped. I couldn't start the engine. The sound might startle it, causing it to fall and then scramble down to the windows. I couldn't move. Any shift in the bunk would alert it to my exact position. I lay absolutely still, listening to the small, rhythmic pressure of its feet and the constant, unnerving melody. The singing stopped directly above my pillow. The only sound now was the quiet, constant click-click-click of the wet, bony mouth right above my head. And then a new sound, a sound so soft I almost missed it, a gentle, repetitive tap-tap-tap against the roof glass of the emergency hatch directly above me. It was tapping with its small, pale hand, not aggressively, but with curiosity, testing the integrity of the barrier. I knew, with a certainty that reached into my bones, that it was not merely curious. It was checking the lock. It was checking the structural integrity of my refuge. I spent the next 3 hours absolutely frozen, holding the knife, listening to the intermittent, rhythmic tapping and the constant, wet clicking. I could feel the infinitesimal pressure of its weight on the roof. It never moved away. It simply sat there, patiently examining the hatch, waiting for me to make a mistake, waiting for the dark to deepen and the air to grow colder. When the first pale wash of light finally began to filter through the mountain pines, casting long, distorted shadows, the wet clicking and the faint tapping stopped. The pressure lifted from the roof. I waited another 5 minutes, then another 10. Finally, I heard the faint scritch-scritch as the small, predatory body slid back down the trailer's aluminum siding. I heard a single, muffled thump as it landed on the ground, and then the sound of dry leaves being softly crunched as it walked, silently and quickly, back into the deep woods. I didn't move until the full, harsh light of morning flooded the cab. I finally climbed out, my legs stiff, and examined the roof. There was nothing visible on the metal, but there were faint, minute scrape marks on the perimeter of the escape hatch, as if something small and sharp had been testing the sealant. I started the engine and tore out of that clearing without a second thought, leaving the delivery and the terrifying isolation behind. I know the mountains are full of things that mimic human sounds, but this was different. It wasn't just imitating. It was using the innocence of a child's song as a lure, a soundtrack to its slow, relentless inspection. I will never forget that soft, reedy melody or the sickening, constant sound of the wet, clicking jaw that accompanied it. I know I was hunted that night by something small, intelligent, and utterly feral, something that announced its arrival with a song and checked the locks with its clawed hands. Let's move to the next story. The night had fallen thick and black over Lake Cumberland in Kentucky, wrapping the twisting backroads in an oppressive, humid darkness. I was hauling refrigerated goods to a fishing resort, but mechanical delay had set me hours behind schedule. I knew I couldn't risk the final miles on pure exhaustion. I needed a few hours of absolute shut-eye. I spotted a faint, overgrown driveway leading off the main road and followed it until I found a small, isolated clearing beside an abandoned lake house. The place was a ruin, windows boarded, paint peeling, but the gravel apron was level, and the isolation was total. I killed the engine, and the heavy silence of the Kentucky hills rushed in, thick with the scent of damp earth and stagnant water. I set the air brakes, double-checked the heavy-duty locks on the doors, pulled the blackout curtains tight, and collapsed into the sleeper bunk. I was out instantly, falling into the deep, heavy well of trucker sleep. I don't know what woke me, but I went from deep sleep to wide-awake terror in a single, gut-wrenching instant. My heart immediately began to pound against my ribs, a dull, deafening drumbeat in the sudden, absolute silence of the cab. I lay motionless, straining my ears, convinced the sound that had woken me was still present. And then I heard it. A faint but distinct, scratching sound right on the thin metal skin of my driver's door, near the handle. It was not the random movement of a branch or a settling noise. It was the sound of a fingernail, or perhaps a sharp, dense claw, scraping lightly, rhythmically against the paint. Scritch, scritch. It was cautious, precise, and utterly focused. I lay rigid, holding my breath, every muscle tense. I slowly, painstakingly, reached my hand out in the darkness, groping for the heavy-duty flashlight I kept secured beneath the seat. The scratching continued, a low, unnerving sound that seemed to vibrate through the metal straight into my skull. Then, the scratching stopped. Abruptly, the silence that followed was suffocating. I gripped the flashlight, my knuckles white, sweat breaking out on my forehead. The tension was immense, focused entirely on that one spot just inches from my head. The silence broke again, this time with a faint, wet sniffing sound. It was thick, shallow, and rapid, like an animal, or something worse, testing the air pressure seal of the door, inhaling the scent of the trapped human warmth inside. The sound was right outside the door, right next to the window, so close it felt like the breath of the thing was passing through the glass. I stayed perfectly still, unwilling to make any sound or movement that would confirm my wakefulness. The sniffing stopped. The silence returned, now charged with a profound, intelligent watchfulness. I knew that whatever was out there was standing perfectly still, utterly silent, and fully aware of my presence. After a long moment, a moment that stretched into an eternity of fear, I saw it. It was a slight movement in the keyhole of my driver's door, a tiny, dark pinprick that slowly began to expand. The keyhole was a small, oblong vertical slot, and the dark space within it began to be filled by something round and glossy. It was an eye, pressed flush against the opening, staring through the narrow cylinder and directly into the cab. It was large, impossibly large, filling the entire available space of the keyhole. It was black and glossy, like the massive, unblinking eye of a deep-sea fish, reflecting the faint, almost non-existent ambient light with a deep, liquid sheen. And it was completely, utterly unblinking. I was paralyzed, locked in a terrifying, forced intimacy with whatever monstrous intelligence resided on the other side of that door. I was eye to eye with the creature, separated by a quarter-inch of steel and a complex lock mechanism. I could feel the sheer, cold intensity of its focus. It wasn't the fearful stare of an animal caught in the light. It was the cold, analytical gaze of a predator. The most terrifying realization hit me, then, a cold, icy clarity that cut through the panic. It wasn't trying to scratch the door open, and it wasn't trying to pry the handle. It had stopped all active effort. It was just looking at me. It had found the best possible aperture, the perfect peephole, and it was using it to size me up, to assess the situation, to study the prey inside the metal shell. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't even reach for the knife. Any sudden movement might startle it, might change its passive observation into active aggression. I lay there in the dark, my body rigid, my gaze locked on that immense, glossy, unblinking black circle in the keyhole, convinced that the monster outside was reading every ounce of my terror. The silence was only broken by the faint, muffled sound of my own internal organs, the pounding of my heart, and the shallow, frantic intake of breath I allowed myself. I imagined the black I taking in the interior of the cab, the dark fabric, the faint shine of the dash, the terrified, motionless form lying in the bunk. I imagined the cold, calculating intelligence behind that black, abyssal surface, deciding on the best course of action, the easiest path of entry. I kept my eye fixed on the keyhole, watching the terrifying, glossy sphere remain utterly still. The minutes stretched into hours of psychological siege. I saw the faint, subtle expansion and contraction of the black surface, a slow, biological movement that only confirmed its living, focused presence. The creature's patience was profound and horrifying. It knew I was there. It knew I was awake. And it was simply waiting, watching the stillness, perhaps hoping that the mounting terror would force me to open the door, to flee the cab, or simply collapse from shock. Finally, after what felt like an entire night of silent, unblinking observation, the sky outside began to turn that pale, sickly gray of approaching morning. The faintest, most subtle sliver of light began to leak into the clearing, softening the absolute blackness. As the light strengthened, the black, glossy circle in the keyhole began to slowly, deliberately retract. The surface of the keyhole was gradually reclaimed by the darkness of the door mechanism, until the opening was once again just an empty, indifferent slot. The silent, horrible stare was gone. I remained still for another 10 minutes, listening for the faint scratching or the wet sniffing sound to return. Nothing, just the slow, damp silence of the woods giving way to dawn. Whatever it was, the light had banished it, sent the horrible, unblinking stare away from my door and back into the dark recesses of the hills. I didn't risk getting out of the cab. I started the engine immediately, throwing the transmission into gear and sped out of that abandoned clearing, never once looking back at the lake house or the keyhole. I know I wasn't just being watched that night. I was being analyzed by a cold, predatory intelligence. The terror of that silent, unblinking eye, the one that wasn't trying to get in, but simply looking at me, is the horror I carry. It found the gap in my defenses, and it used it to confirm that I was the prey, and that the long, dark night was its undisputed territory. I will never look at a locked door the same way again. Let's move to the next story. The final leg of the drive was a punishing crawl through the unforgiving, winding roads of the North Carolina mountains. The fog had rolled in just after sunset, a thick, white, chilling blanket that swallowed the high beams and reduced visibility to mere feet. I was hauling construction materials, and the delivery was still hours away, so I had no choice but to find a spot and wait out the weather. I spotted a faint, dirt track leading off the main road and followed it until I reached a small, forgotten clearing. The clearing held a derelict lake house. It was a massive, two-story wooden structure, its gray facade rotten and sagging. The windows were either smashed or long gone, leaving dark, empty eyes staring out at the small, fog-shrouded pond beyond. The porch was collapsing, and the entire property screamed abandonment. It was the perfect place to hide the rig, and the isolation was total. I killed the engine, and the heavy silence of the mountain fog instantly replaced the roar of the diesel. The air was cold, damp, and tasted of pine and decay. I leaned back in the driver's seat, pulling the curtain tight, letting the exhaustion finally wash over me. I was just settling into the welcome numbness of impending sleep when I heard it. Music. It was incredibly faint at first, thin and tinny, barely cutting through the dense silence. It sounded precisely like a music box, playing a high, mournful, crying melody. It was a simple, repetitive tune, but the quality of the sound was intensely sorrowful, a heartbroken, cyclical lullaby. I sat up instantly, straining to hear. The sound was definitely coming from the direction of the abandoned lake house. My first rational thought was that some local kids had broken in weeks ago and left a battery-powered radio or a toy that was finally running down. But the desolate nature of the place and the fog-shrouded quiet made that explanation feel flimsy. I sat motionless, waiting for the sound to stop, but it continued, unwavering in its mournful cycle. The melody was so heartbreaking, so filled with pure sorrow, that it created an unnerving, emotional weight in the air. Curiosity, mixed with a cold compulsion, forced me to investigate. I grabbed my powerful flashlight and a heavy wrench, climbed out of the cab, and shut the door with a careful, quiet thunk. I walked slowly toward the house, the light cutting a hesitant cone through the thick, swirling fog. As I got closer, the music got noticeably louder, and I realized that my initial assessment was wrong. It wasn't a music box, and it wasn't a tinny recording. It was a woman's voice. It was singing the melody, that simple, mournful, crying tune, but the voice was horribly distorted. It sounded wet and thick, like the singer was submerged underwater, or perhaps the sound was being forced through a tight, unnatural pipe or constricted throat. It was high-pitched and strained, the notes trembling with what sounded exactly like weeping. The sound was profoundly unsettling, the clarity of a human voice, but corrupted into something mechanical and deeply tragic. I reached the collapsing porch and stepped onto the first rotten step, the wood groaning loudly under my weight. The sound was now very clear, emanating from the dark cavity of the front room, visible through one of the smashed window frames. The singing was continuous, a heartbreaking cycle of sorrow that seemed to weep its way through the cracked wood and broken glass. I pointed my flashlight beam into the dark front room. The light cut through the immense, dust-filled darkness, illuminating a space that was clearly gutted and empty. Cobwebs draped the rafters like shrouds, and the floorboards were torn up in places. The beam landed directly on the center of the room, and what I saw made my breath hitch in my chest. There was a rocking chair, an old, high-backed wooden rocker, sitting perfectly level in the center of the dilapidated room. And the chair was slowly, rhythmically rocking back and forth. It was empty. The movement was slow, deliberate, and entirely self-sustained. There was no wind inside the sealed structure, no drafts that could cause such a heavy motion. The chair was rocking with a quiet, patient rhythm, creak, pause, and the singing, that low, heartbreaking, wet melody, was coming from right above the rocking chair, hovering in the air where a head would be, a sound of pure, concentrated, weeping sorrow. It was the soundtrack to an invisible occupant's endless, mournful wait. The terror was immediate and absolute. It wasn't a ghost in the traditional sense. It was a horrifying, unseen presence capable of mechanical motion and vocalizing a song that felt designed to lure an observer in with its overwhelming sadness. The sound was not of a lost soul, but of something predatory using a performance of misery to draw sympathy, to draw a rescue attempt. I stood there for a split second, the flashlight beam fixed on the rocking chair, my mind screaming at the impossibility of the scene. The voice, thick and weeping, seemed to swell slightly, as if acknowledging the light. I didn't wait to see if the chair would slow down, or if the voice would finally change its pattern and call out a name. I dropped the flashlight. The sound of the heavy metal casing hitting the rotten porch wood was muffled but deafening to my ears, and I turned and ran. I ran back toward the truck, scrambling over the gravel, not caring about the noise or the fog, driven by the absolute certainty that the house was not empty, but occupied by something ancient and horrifyingly patient, and that its terrible, sad song was meant specifically for me. I scrambled into the cab, slammed the door shut, and fumbled violently with the key. The engine roared to life, shattering the fog-bound silence with a welcome sound of raw power. I threw the transmission into gear, spun the tires, and tore the rig out of that clearing, never looking back at the dark, silent ruin or the powerful beam of my abandoned flashlight that still cut a straight, lonely line into the dark front room. I drove until the sickly, wet melody was completely swallowed by the miles. I still hear that crying tune sometimes, particularly on foggy nights, and I know that whatever lives inside the deepest, most abandoned houses of the Appalachians uses the greatest human weakness, sympathy, as its cruelest and most effective lure. Let's move to the next story. The haul had taken me deep into the borderlands of rural Virginia, a desolate stretch of the mountains near the West Virginia line where the roads are narrow and the towns are miles apart. It was late, close to 2 a.m., and the fog had begun to roll in, thick and cold. I found a secluded, overgrown pull-off near an abandoned lake house, the kind of place where privacy was guaranteed by decades of neglect. The air was damp and heavy, holding the profound silence of the mountain night. I set the air brakes, killed the engine, and pulled the curtains shut, to try to settle in. Before I could drift off, a flicker of memory hit me, a familiar pang of annoyance, my favorite heavy denim jacket. I had lost it about 3 weeks earlier, a stupid mistake at a truck stop in Ohio. I draped it over the fuel pump handle while paying inside and driven off without it, convinced that beloved, broken-in piece of heavy canvas was gone forever. It was a small thing, but the memory was sharp because the cab was now cold, and I missed the familiar weight of it. I finally managed to fall into a shallow, fitful sleep, disturbed by the settling sounds of the truck and the vast, cold silence outside. I was woken abruptly, not by a loud noise, but by a faint, continuous shuffling sound coming from the back of the trailer. It was a slow, dragging noise like old leather or thick cloth being scraped across the gravel, followed by the soft, distinct crunch of footsteps. I lay motionless in the bunk, heart immediately pounding a desperate rhythm against my ribs. I slowly, agonizingly, shifted my weight until I could peer out the narrow gap in the driver's side blackout curtains. I reached out and adjusted the large side mirror just a fraction of an inch, trying to catch a view of the back of the trailer. The distant, obscured moonlight provided just enough faint illumination to see the gravel lot behind the rig. And that's where I saw it. Standing near the dark rear corner of the trailer, looking immense and unnaturally rigid in the gloom, was a figure. It was tall, impossibly slender, with limbs that seemed too long for its torso. The skin I could see, on the neck and hands, looked horribly pale, almost white, with a sickly translucence that defied the heavy shadows. But what drove the spike of pure, freezing horror deep into my chest was what the figure was wearing. It was my denim jacket. I recognized it instantly, with a terrifying, absolute certainty that overwhelmed logic and denial. I knew that jacket. I knew the faded, heavy-duty denim. More than that, I recognized the faint, splattered, white paint stain on the left shoulder, a mark I'd gotten months ago while touching up the paint on the storage shed of my home. It was unmistakable. The figure was standing motionless, its back to the cab, its posture stiff and unnatural, looking toward the dark, abandoned lake house. My jacket looked huge on the slender, towering frame, the collar pulled up high, swallowing the figure's neck. I was paralyzed, locked in a state of utter cold shock. How was this possible? I lost that jacket hundreds of miles away weeks ago. Had this thing found it? Or had it somehow followed it? As I stared, the figure began to move. But not its body. Slowly, deliberately, with a sickening, grinding motion that seemed to defy the natural mechanics of the human spine, the figure turned its head. It pivoted 180 degrees, the body remaining perfectly rigid, facing the lake house, while the face slowly turned until it was staring directly at the cab of the truck. I couldn't make out any features in the deep shadow of the collar and the gloom, but I knew it was looking directly at me. I could feel the cold, unblinking intensity of its gaze cutting through the glass and the thin fabric of the curtains. The stillness of the figure was immense, the only movement being that slow, impossible rotation of the neck. It held the stare for an agonizing duration. Then it slowly raised a long, bony hand. The hand was thin and pale, almost skeletal, emerging from the sleeve of my favorite jacket. And with terrifying purpose, it moved the hand and slowly, deliberately, put it into the large, patched breast pocket of my denim jacket. It stood there, its head fully turned, its hand buried deep in the pocket that had once held my keys, my wallet, and my life. It wasn't searching, it was marking possession. It was demonstrating knowledge. It knew the garment, it knew its utility, and it knew I was watching. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't a stray person who happened to find a discarded item. The thing hadn't just found the jacket. It had somehow traced the jacket's owner back to this desolate location. It was wearing my lost possession, standing right outside my truck and looking directly into my soul with an unnatural stillness that promised infinite patience. I sat there, gripping the edge of the bunk, sweat cold on my skin, watching the towering, slender figure standing sentinel with its hand in my pocket. I dared not move, daring not to start the engine. I knew any sudden noise would break the silence and shatter the passive observation, forcing the creature to act. The terrifying standoff lasted until the heavy, cold darkness of the pre-dawn began to lighten, bleeding that pale, sickly gray through the fog. The figure never moved its body. It maintained that impossible, twisted posture, staring at the cab with the same chilling intensity. As the light grew strong enough to faintly illuminate the features of the jacket, the faded blue, the paint stain, the figure finally broke its pose. It slowly, smoothly turned its head back to face the lake house, the spine seeming to twist back into a natural, forward-facing position with an unnerving fluidity. It pulled the hand out of the pocket, and with a final, deliberate shuffling sound of the heavy denim rubbing against its pale skin, it began to walk slowly toward the dark trees. It walked with an unnatural, elongated gait, the jacket moving with the rhythm of its sickening stride, until the fog in the pines swallowed the pale, slender shape completely. I waited another hour, rigid and cold, until the sun had fully risen, casting sharp shadows on the empty lot. I started the engine, threw the truck into gear, and drove out of that clearing without a moment's hesitation. I never slowed down until I hit a major state highway, leaving the memory and, more importantly, leaving my favorite jacket behind. I couldn't bear the thought of trying to retrieve it. I knew that jacket was no longer mine. It was a marker, a symbol of a hunt, and the thing that was wearing, it was an intelligent, tracking predator that had used a forgotten piece of clothing to confirm its surveillance. I will always remember that tall, slender shape, standing silent in the moonlight, its head turned around backward, wearing my lost jacket. I know it's still out there, hunting in the hills, wearing my familiar paint-stained denim, and waiting for the right time to reappear. Let's move to the next story. The delivery required me to drive deep into the oppressive solitude of the Great Smoky Mountains, hauling specialized fishing gear to a small, private cabin situated on the shore of an isolated, unnamed lake. The roads were barely paved, winding tracks that seemed designed to swallow sunlight and sound. By the time I reached the destination, well after midnight, the exhaustion was a cold, constant throb behind my eyes. I parked the rig right on a small, gravel turnaround next to the single, dark cabin, set the air brakes, and killed the engine. The silence that rushed in was absolute, heavy with the scent of wet pine needles and the faint, metallic tang of cold lake water. I checked my locks meticulously, a habit born of years on the road, and pulled the blackout curtains tight. The cabin was utterly dark, and the lake was a flat, black sheet reflecting nothing but the heavy, starless sky. I dropped into the sleeper bunk, and despite the isolation, the sheer weight of fatigue pulled me under instantly. I woke up naturally, stiff and disoriented, just as the first cold, pale light of dawn began to seep through the mountains. I lay there for a minute, allowing the realization of where I was to settle. I sat up, stretched my arms high above my head, and ran my hand across the rough stubble on my face. It was going to be a long day of driving. As I was leaning forward, reaching for the ignition key to warm up the engine, I looked over at the passenger seat headrest. Right next to me, separated by only the small gap of the center console, there was a mark. A large, dark, perfectly circular mark pressed into the gray fabric of the headrest. It was unmistakable against the dry, dusty fabric. It was the color of deep moisture, a uniform dark gray where the fibers were soaked and compressed. I leaned closer, my gaze locked on the disturbing stain. It was still cold. I reached out a hesitant finger and touched it. The fabric was faintly, profoundly damp to the touch and chillingly cold, even in the cool morning air. The mark had not been there when I went to sleep. I always checked the cab for spills or dirt before settling in. I sat back, my heart starting to pound with a slow, heavy dread. The mark was exactly the size and shape of a large human head. It was positioned perfectly, as if someone or something had been leaning heavily into the truck, resting its wet head against the passenger seat headrest, right next to the driver's side, using the curved shape for support. My mind raced through rational explanations. Condensation, a spilled drink, a leak in the roof. But the moisture was localized, perfectly round and cold to the touch. The truck had been parked for hours, locked tight against the weather. Condensation would be general, a spilled drink would run, and a leak would streak the window. This was a direct, precise impression. I stared at the spot where a wet head had rested, inches from my sleeping body, separated only by the thin glass of the passenger window. I imagined the weight, the pressure of a large skull leaning there, the moisture transferring to the fabric from the outside. I slowly reached for the passenger door window and lowered it a crack, checking the exterior glass. There, right outside the window, was a faint, hazy smear on the glass, just where the headrest would meet the top of the glass. It was condensation, thick and greasy, but localized only to that specific spot, confirming that something warm and wet had been pressed against the outside of the cold glass for a considerable amount of time. I slid out of the driver's seat and onto the floor, pulling myself toward the passenger door, my movements restricted by the narrow cab. I reached out and gently ran my hand over the exterior of the window where the smear was. My hand came back damp, but not with simple dew. The residue was cold and left a slight, almost oily film on my palm. I knew the terrifying truth instantly. Whatever made that mark had been leaning into my truck, right next to the driver's seat, watching me sleep through the window. It had been close enough, patient enough, and heavy enough for its wet head to condense the air and fog the interior of the glass, leaving a cold, damp impression on the fabric. I imagined the creature, something large, heavy, and wet, standing silently next to the truck, its cold, wet face pressed against the glass, utterly still, watching my slow, deep breathing in the dark. The wet suggested it had come directly out of the nearby lake, crawling up the bank, silent and unseen. The cold certainty that I had been studied, analyzed, and breathed upon while I was most vulnerable was a profound violation. It hadn't tried to break in. It hadn't tried to open the door. It had simply observed, with a terrifying, silent patience. I scrambled back into the driver's seat, wiping the disturbing mark on the headrest with a tissue, desperate to remove the physical evidence of its presence. The fabric was cold, and the subtle, metallic scent of the lake water, now mixed with the dampness, clung to the material. I couldn't completely remove the psychological impression. I pulled out my phone and checked the lock status on the doors again, 4 heavy-duty locks securing me inside the cab. I looked out the windows, scanning the deserted clearing and the dark lake, but everything was still, bathed in the deceptive calm of the early morning. I started the engine, the roar of the diesel a welcome, aggressive sound against the heavy silence. I threw the transmission into gear and immediately pulled out of the clearing, driving hard and fast down the track, tires spitting gravel. I didn't stop to make the delivery or sign the papers. I just drove until the dense forest gave way to the sanity of the state highway. I spent the rest of the day driving with the heater cranked up high, trying to bake the chill out of the cab and the terror out of my memory. Every time I looked over at the passenger seat, the faint, slightly darker gray patch on the headrest was visible, a constant, chilling reminder. I knew that something large and wet, something that ruled the deepest, darkest pockets of that mountain lake, had come up from the water, stood silently next to my thin metal refuge, and studied my face in the darkness. It hadn't come for the truck or the cargo. It had come to look at me, and that simple, predatory curiosity was the most horrifying thing of all. The cold, wet mark on the headrest is the proof that I was being carefully sized up for a future meeting. Let's move to the next story. The day's haul had been brutal, winding through the unforgiving passes of the Blue Ridge Mountains in North Carolina. I was supposed to be further along, but the slow, punishing roads forced me to pull over well short of my destination. I found an isolated gravel pull-off high on a ridge overlooking a massive, secluded reservoir, not far from the Lake Lure area. The view, even in the fading light, was stunning, a vast, dark body of water surrounded by endless, silent peaks. It was the kind of deep wilderness where you felt utterly alone. I killed the powerful diesel engine, and the resulting silence was so profound it felt like pressure against my eardrums. I checked the locks, pulled the heavy blackout curtains across the cab, and was just settling into the bunk, enjoying the brief, restorative peace. The quiet was absolute. Then the whispers started. They weren't loud, and they didn't come from a specific direction. They were just there everywhere at once, faint and constant, a low, complex hum of vocalization that seemed to permeate the air around the cab. It sounded like a dozen or more people talking simultaneously, their voices too low, too distant, and too intermingled to make out any coherent words. It was like standing on the edge of a vast, crowded room, hearing only the low, continuous wash of conversation, but with a strangely intimate quality, as if they were talking about me. The sound itself was deeply, immediately unsettling. It wasn't wind, and it wasn't the natural sounds of the forest. It was clearly language, faint and constant, pressed right up against the edge of my hearing. I lay rigid, straining to listen, try to convince myself it was just the residual noise of the truck settling, or maybe the faint sounds of the cooling air brakes. But the sound was persistent and organic. I slowly, carefully slid over to the driver's seat. I reached up and cautiously cracked the driver's side window open about an inch, hoping to let the sound focus. As soon as the gap opened, a distinct, shocking smell wafted into the cab, cold and sharp. It was a strong metallic odor, like old pennies or dried blood, mixed with the dampness of the mountain air. It was the unmistakable smell of wet copper. The whispers, encouraged by the open aperture, seemed to focus. They didn't get dramatically louder, but the general wash of sound sharpened, pulling the fragmented voices together into a clearer, more discernible presence just outside the glass. The metallic copper smell intensified, filling the small space of the cab, making the air feel heavy and slightly charged. I strained every muscle in my face, trying to decipher the sound. They were still low, but no longer random. They had achieved a rhythm, a unified purpose. And then, terrifyingly, I caught a fragmented sequence of words. They were spoken in that same low, sibilant, multiple-voiced whisper, yet they were distinct. "Come, to the water." The phrase was slow, simple, and utterly compelling. It wasn't a question, but a directive delivered in a voice that tasted of the mountain air and the metal scent that now choked the cab. The moment I heard those words, an intense, cold, and immediate urge slammed into me. It wasn't intellectual. It was a pure, physical compulsion, a profound desire to open the door, step out of the cab, and walk down the dark slope toward the silent, invisible reservoir below. The whispers felt like they were tugging at the very edge of my consciousness, promising peace or revelation in the deep, cold water. I fought the urge with a terrible, desperate effort of will. I gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, forcing my muscles to remain locked in the seat. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, pressing against the glass and against my mind. The air in the cab began to feel thick, almost magnetic, like the atmosphere before a massive thunderstorm, charged with an invisible, terrifying power. The whispers changed, growing slightly more complex, and I caught another fragmented command, "Easy, sleep." In the cool, the coldness that emanated from the sound, mixed with the sharp copper odor, was bone deep. The copper smell, I realized with a chilling certainty, was not just the scent of metal. It was the sharp, metallic odor of blood, of old pennies, of something ancient and hungry that lived in the water and was using the silence and the isolation to exert a strange, psychic lure. I yanked my hand off the steering wheel and violently slammed the window roller, grinding the glass shut. I threw the lock down with a loud, final clang that was deafening in the charged silence. The physical action of closing the barrier seemed to momentarily disrupt the assault. I didn't wait. I reached for the keys, fumbling desperately to engage the ignition. The whispers were still there, right outside the door, muffled but gaining volume again, angry and frustrated at the barrier. I finally found the tumbler, turned the key, and the heavy diesel engine roared to life with a beautiful, aggressive sound that momentarily overwhelmed the silent terror. I slammed the transmission into gear, released the air brakes with a loud hiss, and tore the rig out of that pull-off. I didn't look in the mirrors. I drove blindly, pushing the truck hard along the winding, dark mountain roads until I reached a main highway and saw the reassuring glow of distant sodium lamps. I drove until the constant, sibilant wash of the whispers faded completely away, leaving only the steady, comforting sound of the diesel engine and the rush of the tires on the asphalt. I knew those whispers were a lure, a cold, focused attempt to draw me, exhausted and alone, down to the edge of the reservoir. And the copper smell, that sharp, metallic taste of blood and pennies, was the scent of whatever lived below the surface. Something that required silence, isolation, and a cold, slow walk into its watery depths. I escaped the siren's song, but I will never forget the metallic taste of that whisper and the cold, terrifying urge to surrender to the water. I know the thing is still waiting on that ridge, speaking to the silence, luring the next exhausted soul to its cool, waiting depths. Let's move to the next story. The late delivery took me deep into the mountain spine of Georgia to an isolated, defunct lake house complex that looked like it had been rotting since the late 80s. The main highway was miles behind me, and the access road was a crumbling, winding ribbon of asphalt bordered by dense, dark woods that seemed to lean in over the pavement. The air was cold, damp, and overwhelmingly quiet. I was driving slowly, straining to read the faded road markers in the weak glow of my headlights, when I saw the movement. Up ahead, where the road curved sharply, a tall, slender shadow crossed the beam of my headlights, moving from the passenger side toward the driver's side woods. It was swift, fluid, and massive, easily 8 or 9 feet tall, momentarily breaking the light before vanishing into the black tangle of the tree line. I slammed on the brakes. The air brakes hissed violently, and the truck skidded to a stop right in the middle of the narrow road. I was instantly awake, adrenaline flooding my system. I looked out, peering into the gloom where the shadow had disappeared. I didn't see a deer, and I didn't see a bear. The figure had been too tall, too quick, and too fluid for any normal animal. I waited for a full minute, scanning the woods, but saw nothing but the dense, unforgiving mass of the Appalachian forest. I rationalized it as a trick of the fog and the winding headlights, shrugged off the feeling of dread, and slowly began to ease the truck forward again. I had barely rolled 10 feet when the hair on the back of my neck stood up, and my peripheral vision screamed at me. I caught movement, an immense dark vertical shape standing motionless in the tree line, about 30 feet to my left. It hadn't been there a second ago. I snapped my head to the left, looking directly at it. The creature instantly froze. It became a perfect black column against the already dark woods, impossibly still. It was massive, much taller than any man I had ever seen, its height emphasized by its slender, almost skeletal frame. It was entirely black, a matte, light-absorbing shadow that seemed to pull the light from my headlamps into itself. The head was positioned high on the neck, large and oddly shaped, a strange bulbous silhouette that made it look top-heavy and grotesquely unnatural. I stared at it for a full minute, holding my breath, my foot hovering over the accelerator. The creature did not move a single fraction of an inch. It was locked in a state of absolute, unnatural stillness, a black statue observing me from the edge of the woods. I looked at the trees around it, the saplings and the dense underbrush. There was no movement, no shaking of leaves, no indication of wind or disturbance. It was just standing there, utterly still, watching. My eyes ached from the effort of maintaining a direct stare. I knew I couldn't sit there all night, but I was terrified of what would happen if I broke the contact. Finally, necessity overcame fear. I slowly, carefully began to turn my eyes back toward the road, just enough to find the steering wheel and the dash. The instant my direct focus left the creature, the split second my eyes began to travel away from its position. I heard it, a rapid, wet sloshing sound. It wasn't loud, but it was fast, aggressive, and immediate, like something large and heavy was moving quickly through shallow water or damp mud. I snapped my head back to the left, fixing my stare instantly on the spot in the woods. The creature was 30 feet closer. It was now standing right at the edge of the asphalt, practically looming over the narrow shoulder of the road. Having covered that distance in a fraction of a second, I had averted my gaze. It was locked back into its terrifying, silent stillness, the black, bulbous head angled slightly toward the cab. It was so close I could feel its sheer, immense presence pressing against the metal of the truck. The realization was a punch to the gut. I was caught in a terrible, silent game of red light, green light. The creature only walked and walked fast when I was not looking directly at it. My direct observation was its only restraint. I knew I was in profound danger. My heart was hammering so hard it felt like it would break my ribs. I couldn't risk the slow, cautious movement of trying to reverse or turn around. I had to proceed, and I had to break the pattern. I slowly, meticulously brought my foot down onto the accelerator, easing the massive truck forward again. As the truck began to roll, the creature remained still, its immense, black form just outside my window, maintaining the terrifying, motionless stare. I didn't dare look directly at it again, but I was acutely aware of its position in my peripheral vision, a giant, black column pacing the truck. I had to risk a few glances forward to steer the rig around the winding road. Every time my focus shifted to the road ahead, the silent, sloshing sound immediately erupted from the shoulder. Slosh, slosh, slosh. I would whip my eyes back to the left, and the creature would be closer to the cab, locked instantly into its static, terrifying pose, its head slightly further forward, its massive, black bulk seeming to dwarf the passenger window. It was running alongside the truck every time I looked away, using the moment of my necessary distraction to gain ground. The terror was agonizing, a slow, high-tension crawl through the black woods. I knew if I looked away for more than a second, if I checked the speedometer, if I adjusted the mirror, if I blinked too long, the creature would be right next to the cab, its long, pale hands on the door handle. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my hands ached, my eyes fixed in a desperate, forward stare, using only the barest sliver of my peripheral vision to track the black shape pacing me. I couldn't look left, but I could hear it. The moment the road dipped, and I had to focus on the turn, the sloshing sound would start again, followed by the heavy, ominous silence of its freezing. Finally, after what felt like an hour of pure psychological torture, I saw the faint, blessed glow of the main highway lights in the distance. The creature was still pacing me, but its silent, sloshing pursuit was falling behind as the road straightened. I risked everything, slamming my foot to the floor. The diesel engine roared, and the truck shot forward. I did not look left. I kept my eyes locked on the distant lights, terrified of what would happen if I took my eyes off the road for even a single second, convinced that if I looked back, the creature would be standing right behind the truck, or perhaps already perched on the roof. I drove out of that complex and onto the main road without ever looking in the rearview mirror, breaking the speed limit until the mountains were a distant, hazy memory. I know that thing is still there, massive and slender, playing its terrible, silent game on the deserted roads of the Georgia mountains. The horror wasn't in the sound or the attack. It was in the absolute, patient knowledge that the creature knew the single, profound weakness of my perception, and it used the simple act of looking away as its cue to move. I left that road with the cold certainty that the only thing keeping me alive was my uninterrupted gaze, and the knowledge that the creature will be waiting for the next tired soul to slow down and dare to look away. Let's move to the next story. The breakdown happened exactly where a truck driver never wants a breakdown to happen. On a narrow, twisting mountain road deep in Monongahela National Forest, far from any viable service station. The trailer's inner dual tire had blown, the sound a sharp, final thwack against the heavy rhythm of the engine. I managed to limp the rig onto a barely there gravel pull-off, a deserted spot overlooking a small, dark lake near a dilapidated, forgotten lake house. The place was silent and smelled of pine and deep water, and the sun was already starting its slow sink behind the unforgiving peaks. I was facing a long, solitary repair. I threw on the hazard lights, grabbed my jack and torque wrench, and got to work in the rapidly fading light. Replacing a shredded dual tire on the side of a mountain is a punishing, hour-long affair, and I fought with rusted bolts and immense weight in the gloom until my back was screaming and my hands were shredded. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the spare was on. I tossed the massive, heavy flat tire, the old, greasy rubber and bent steel wheel, onto the gravel bed just behind the trailer, figuring I'd load it properly in the morning. Exhausted, covered in grime and sweat, I climbed back into the cab, locked the door, and passed out instantly in the sleeper bunk. I woke abruptly, shivering, in the dead of the deepest part of the night, maybe 4 a.m. The hazard lights were still flashing, casting a sickly, orange pulse over the interior of the cab. What woke me was a low, heavy dragging sound coming from the gravel right outside the trailer. It was a rough, continuous scrape, a C-C-C-H-H-H, C-C-C-H-H-H, like something dense and heavy was being pulled across the rough stones. I lay rigid, listening. The sound was slow, labored, and moving away from the truck toward the impenetrable blackness of the woods. It wasn't the sound of an animal. It was too heavy, too deliberate, and the rhythm was off, uneven, suggesting a bipedal struggle. Slowly, carefully, I slid to the driver's seat and peered out the side mirror, the flashing hazard light providing the only intermittent illumination. I strained my eyes, trying to resolve the movement at the back of the trailer. And then I saw it. A large, hunched figure, taller than a man but bent almost double under a load, was moving silently away from the truck and toward the dense line of pines. It was a dark, massive silhouette, its movements slow and unnatural. The shape was entirely obscured by shadow and distance, but I could clearly see the outline of the object it was dragging. It was my flat tire. The massive, heavy steel wheel, with the shredded rubber still attached, was bouncing and scraping across the gravel, pulled by the hunched figure. I watched in stunned, cold silence as the creature, never once looking back, slowly dragged the 100+ pounds of steel and rubber into the blackness of the woods. It moved with a powerful, relentless persistence, its feet making no audible sound beyond the rough scrape of the heavy load. I was paralyzed, unable to process the sheer, ridiculous horror of the sight. Why? Why would something that massive, that clearly intelligent enough to target an item of value, drag a broken, greasy truck tire into the woods? I watched the figure and the scraping tire disappear into the wall of trees. The sound faded entirely, and the heavy, black silence returned, more absolute and terrifying than before. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, rigid with a cold, confused dread, unable to reconcile the sight of the hunched monster with the absurdity of its theft. When the first cold, pale light of morning finally began to filter through the pines, I scrambled out of the cab, heart pounding, to confirm the impossible. I ran to the back of the trailer. The tire was gone. The heavy grease and mud smears it had left on the steel of the trailer's undercarriage were still visible, but the spot where I'd left the wheel was empty. My breath hitched. In the exact spot where the heavy, dirty tire had been resting, there was something else. A neat, clean circle of small, smooth, dark stones had been arranged on the gravel. The stones were all uniform in size and color, placed with meticulous precision. And in the dead center of the circle, resting on the gravel, was a single, perfectly clean bird skull. It was small, delicate, bleached white, and utterly immaculate. It wasn't a theft. It was a trade. The creature hadn't simply stolen the tire. It had made an offering. It had taken a piece of my technology, a piece of my world, and in exchange, it had left behind a piece of its own. The neatness of the stone circle, the unsettling cleanliness of the skull, all spoke to a ritualistic intelligence, a strange, profound understanding of exchange. The thing had an economy, a currency, and a ritual, and I had just become a participant in its bizarre transaction. I didn't touch the stones or the skull. I backed away slowly, the nausea rising in my throat. I looked toward the woods, no longer seeing just trees, but seeing the deep, silent territory of a creature that valued heavy rubber and steel over bone and stone. What did it need the tire for? What did the bird skull symbolize? The questions were endless, and the possibilities were purely terrifying. I knew I couldn't stay a second longer. I didn't wait to see if the creature would return a check on its payment, or what the next exchange might entail. Would it take the whole truck next? What would it leave behind? I scrambled back to the cab, threw the engine alive, and slammed the heavy rig into gear. I didn't care about the mess I made of the pull-off. I drove out of that clearing, tires spitting gravel, and didn't stop until the deep, cold woods of the Monongahela were far behind me. The sight of that hunched figure dragging the heavy tires burned into my mind, but the deepest, most chilling terror is reserved for the image of that neat circle of dark stones and the small, clean skull. It proved that the monster in the woods wasn't just feral. It was intelligent, it was ritualistic, and it was trading. I escaped its territory, but I left behind a piece of myself, a mundane piece of metal and rubber, in exchange for the bone-white proof of its strange, dark rules. And I know the transaction isn't truly complete. Let's move to the last story. The long haul had taken me deep into the Appalachian foothills of eastern Kentucky. It was well past 1 a.m., and I was driving through a winding, isolated valley when the fog rolled in. It wasn't the thin, misty kind of fog. This was thick, unnatural white obscurity, a wall that descended instantly and dropped visibility to absolute zero. I slammed on the brakes, the heavy rig skidding slightly on the damp asphalt. I had no choice but to pull off the road and wait. I managed to creep the truck onto a wide, gravel pull-off that was clearly an old parking area for a defunct, forgotten lake house community. I killed the engine, set the air brakes, and the sudden quiet was heavy and immense, broken only by the rapid, anxious drumming of my own heartbeat. The fog was so dense outside the cab that it felt less like air and more like a cold, tangible presence pressed right up against the glass. I was reaching for the curtains, intending to settle in for the forced wait when I heard it. A steady, rhythmic splashing sound. It was coming from just past the lake house, maybe 50 or 60 yards away, where the bank dropped down to the water. It was the clear, undeniable sound of someone swimming vigorously with strong, determined strokes. The sound was instantly unsettling. The temperature had dropped sharply with the fog, and I knew from the weather report that the water in these mountain reservoirs was near freezing this time of year. No sane person would be swimming in that black, frigid water in the middle of the night, in a fog so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. I pulled myself up to the driver's seat, my mind scrambling for a rational explanation. A boat had capsized, someone was drowning, but the splashing was too controlled, too rhythmic to be a struggle. It sounded like a focused, dedicated workout. I fumbled for my powerful, handheld spotlight, a heavy-duty utility beam I kept for checking loads, and yanked the curtains back a fraction. I aimed the beam out the window, cutting the harsh, focused cone of light through the thick, swirling white mass of the fog, aiming toward the water. The beam pierced the opacity, and for a horrible, clear second, I saw him. He was swimming strongly, heading away from the shore, propelling himself toward the deeper, black center of the lake. He was a man, large and muscular, visible only as a pale, moving figure against the black water. And he was completely naked. His skin was stark white, almost luminous in the spotlight beam, contrasting violently with the surrounding darkness of the reservoir. The most terrifying thing was that he wasn't making any sound except for the strong, determined splash of his strokes. No grunts of exertion, no gasps for air, no shivering, no sounds of distress. Just the steady, rhythmic splash, splash, splash of his arms churning the freezing water. I threw the cab door open, the shock of the cold air and the sound of my own voice cutting through the unnatural quiet. "Hey, are you all right? Do you need help?" I shouted, cupping my hands around my mouth, my voice sounding weak and thin against the vast silence. The man didn't respond. He didn't slow his strokes, didn't turn his head, didn't give the slightest indication that he had even registered the bright beam of light or the sound of my shout. His head remained fixed forward, cutting through the surface tension of the water, his pale form relentless and fixed on his terrible destination. I slammed the door shut again, shivering violently, and pressed the spotlight back against the glass. The man was swimming faster now, with an unnerving urgency, moving directly toward the densest part of the fog bank that hovered over the middle of the reservoir. The scene defied every law of nature and sanity. This man was deliberately swimming into a void, naked, in freezing water, and exhibiting the chilling indifference of a sleepwalker. He was not struggling, he was migrating. I watched, mouth dry, my whole body trembling. His pale silhouette was getting smaller, further away, swallowed slowly by the vastness of the water and the white shroud of the fog. Then the splashing stopped. Abruptly, finally, and completely. The rhythmic sound simply ceased. The ensuing silence was immediate and absolute, heavier and more terrifying than the whispers or the dragging sounds of the deepest night. I held the light fixed on the spot where I had last seen his head break the surface. The beam cut into the white fog, illuminating only the empty, swirling obscurity of the air above the black water. I waited for 10 agonizing minutes, my spotlight beam unwavering, locked on the spot. I listened with desperate intensity for any sound, a gasp, a choke, a final gurgle, any sound of drowning or struggle. There was nothing. The man was simply gone. He hadn't called for help. He hadn't bobbed back to the surface. He had vanished, swimming out to a terrible, silent destination in the cold, black water, completely indifferent to his own survival. I slowly lowered the spotlight, the beam falling uselessly onto the dashboard. The cabin was utterly silent, the fog pressed tight against the glass, and the black lake waited just beyond. I sat there, trying to process the chilling indifference of the act. He hadn't been an accident victim. He had been purposeful, driven by a terrible, silent need to reach the center of the lake. The terror settled in, cold and deep. It wasn't the fear of a ghost or a creature, but the fear of a corrupted human intent. That man was not lost. He was fulfilling a contract, surrendering himself to the cold, waiting silence of the deep mountain reservoir. He had walked out of the warmth and the light, stripped himself bare, and swam with focused vigor into the freezing fog, driven by a compulsion far greater than the will to live. I didn't turn on the engine right away. I sat there until the weak light of the dawn began to thin the fog, listening to the heavy, breathing silence of the mountains, terrified that I would hear the splashing start again, perhaps closer to the shore, perhaps right under my window. I knew whatever claimed that man was not a simple current or hypothermia. Something in that cold, black water had called him out, and he had answered, swimming with an unnatural strength toward the silent, inevitable embrace of the fog. I left that place haunted by the memory of his pale, silent form, swimming out to meet a fate he embraced with horrifying determination. The mountains hold their secrets deep, and sometimes those secrets lure the living out into the cold, where they simply vanish without a sound.